Hey guys, tonight we're going way back, like 3,000 years back, to a world where you could be considered a living god and also be expected to marry your own sister. Yeah, buckle up. This is the story of ancient Egyptian pharaohs and why, despite all the gold, pyramids and divine status, they kept things disturbingly in the family. You probably won't survive this kind of lifestyle. I mean, genetically speaking, your odds are not great. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not a pyramid scheme, I promise, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from and what time it is there. I always read them. Seriously, I'm nosy like that. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of the Nile River, somewhere around 1500 BCE. The air is thick and warm and reeds sway in the lazy current. Behind you, rising out of the desert like some impossible mirage, is a palace glowing gold in the sunrise. Inside, the most powerful person in the entire kingdom is waking up. He's divine. He's untouchable. He's expected to make the sun rise just by existing. And, oh yeah, his new bride is also his sister. It's not because there weren't enough people to choose from. Egypt was packed with farmers, scribes, priests, nobles, servants. The royal dating pool was not shallow. But for a pharaoh, the bloodline wasn't just a matter of ancestry. It was the literal source of his godhood. If you're born of two gods, you stay a god. If you start marrying randos from outside the family, well, that divine glow starts to dim, or so they believed. This idea wasn't something casual. It was built into the very framework of their society. Egyptian kings weren't just rulers, they were considered the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon-headed god of kingship and the sky. Their divine mother, often Isis. Their divine father, Osiris, which meant every time a pharaoh married his sister, the court could squint really hard and say they were just reenacting the cosmic cycle. You know, as above, so below, but make it awkward. Now you're probably thinking, did they really believe that? Or was this just a convenient excuse to keep power within the same few hands? And honestly, it's probably both. Scholars still debate just how deeply ancient Egyptians took these divine metaphors. Some say the religious belief was genuine, that people truly believed these marriages maintained the cosmic order. Others argue that religion was a mask, carefully applied to cover a very strategic, very human desire, keeping the throne locked up to years and tight in one genetic vault. Imagine being a prince born into that world. You've spent your childhood in luxury, raised to recite hymns, oversee rituals, and wave vaguely at your subjects from balcony windows. And then, as you hit puberty, there's a royal decree. Congratulations, you're marrying your sister next Tuesday. You get the feeling even he isn't thrilled. But that's the point. This isn't about love. It's about inheritance. It's about legitimacy. It's about reminding the entire kingdom that no matter how rich or respected they are, they will never be as sacred as you. But don't assume every sibling got the same treatment. These weren't Disney princes and princesses walking hand in hand through the papyrus fields. Royal siblings were often pitted against each other, their marriages used as tactical tools. One sister might marry her brother and be elevated to queen. Another might be shuffled into a temple and declared the wife of Amun, which sounds nice until you realise she's basically being stored like a spiritual battery for political power. You wander into the palace's inner chambers. Marble floors, lotus-scented air, intricate murals of gods smiting enemies and sitting on thrones. And there in a side hall is a family tree carved into the stone. Except it's not so much a tree as it is a tangled vine spiralling in on itself. Names repeat, titles blur. Daughter of and sister of and wife of, sometimes all three belong to one woman. And it's not even hidden. This is their pride. Here's a fringe fact to chew on. Ancient Egyptian art never really shows affection between the pharaoh and his queen. You get lots of stylized poses, holding hands like robots or standing stiffly side by side. But in one rare tomb painting, a royal couple is actually shown kissing on the lips, tender even. And yes, it's a brother and sister. Romantic? Maybe. Gross? Yeah. But also illuminating. To them, the royal marriage wasn't shameful, it was sacred. That being said, not all marriages were equal. A pharaoh might marry his sister for divine legitimacy, but he'd also have multiple wives, often including daughters of powerful nobles or foreign kings. But only one queen got the title of Great Royal Wife. Guess who that usually was? Yep, Sis, the one who shared his divine blood. Now step out of the palace and walk down the road into a bustling city square. There, among basket sellers and fishmongers, common people go about their day. They know about the pharaoh's sister wife, it's not a secret. But they also know their ruler is no ordinary man. He's got the gods behind him. His blood is power, and power needs to stay pure. That's the story everyone's been sold, and for the most part it sticks. But let's not pretend this was a uniquely Egyptian thing. We'll get there. For now, settle into the warm breeze off the Nile, listen to the reed flutes playing in the distance, and try not to think too hard about your royal family reunion turning into a wedding. You're only just getting started, and trust me, the family drama is just heating up. You're still in that same sun-bleached city, the sandstone walls of the palace glowing under the mid-morning light. But now you're digging a little deeper, literally. Imagine the royal family tree not as a neat diagram, but as a tangled series of scribbles with no sense of boundaries. Welcome to the ancient Egyptian royal lineage, where keeping your gods and your gene pool close was a way of life. Today you're joining the scribes as they unroll papyri, scratch names into the temple walls, and try to make sense of who's related to whom. Here's the setup. Pharaohs weren't just kings, they were gods in flesh. Descendants of deities that had been ruling since the beginning of time. That's the official story anyway. The mythic family at the heart of it all. That would be the Ennead of Heliopolis, a divine soap opera that included Osiris, his wife and sister Isis, and their son Horus, who basically sets the template for every pharaoh to follow. If Horus ruled with his mother's divine support, then so too must a human king. So the symbolism is pretty on the nose. Marry your sister to echo the gods and legitimize your rule. Now imagine being an ancient historian, sitting in a scroll-covered chamber, trying to track all this. Every pharaoh wants to prove he descended directly from a god or goddess, preferably through a line of sister mothers and brother fathers that could put modern geneticists into cardiac arrest. But the logic checks out for them. Royal blood is holy. Regular blood is, contaminated. You lean in closer over a dusty scroll and notice something odd. The names are repeated over and over. Tias, Utimweas, Akhenaten. Are they sisters, daughters, cousins? The answer is yes, and sometimes all three. Pharaohs like Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, and Akhenaten didn't just marry within the family once, they made it a whole lifestyle. And keeping those names straight was part of their propaganda machine. If a king wanted to prove his right to rule, he'd stress how his wife was his full sister, not just some royal noble picked from the court. Sibling marriages weren't dirty secrets. They were credentials. Take Amenhotep I, for instance. He's the second pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He likely married his sister, even though the evidence is a little foggy. But what we do know is that his own mother had been married to her brother, and his successors proudly carried on the trend. Why? Because they weren't just trying to keep power, they were trying to embody it. Power wasn't just held, it was bred. And if your bloodline had even a whiff of common ancestry, well, good luck commanding the sun to rise. There's this one relief you pause in front of, carved into the white limestone walls of Deir el-Bahari. It shows a pharaoh and his queen standing side by side, both towering over rows of kneeling captives. But look closer. Their faces are almost identical. The shape of the nose, the curve of the jaw mirror images. It's subtle, but you're starting to see the same features again and again across generations. That's not a coincidence. That's what happens when the same few families intermarry for centuries. And it doesn't stop with blood. Power in ancient Egypt didn't flow in straight lines, it moved in circles. Marriage wasn't about romance, it was politics. A king needed a queen who could stand as his equal, not just in status, but in cosmic resonance. His sister fit that role perfectly. She'd been raised with the same divine education, trained in ritual, fluent in the mythologies that propped up the entire government. She wasn't just wife material, she was a co-goddess. And here's where it gets weirder. Sometimes it wasn't even clear who fathered which child. Ancient Egyptian records were more interested in appearances and titles than biological accuracy. If a princess had the right aura of divinity, it didn't matter who her parents actually were. What mattered was what people believed. Some kings even retroactively rewrote family histories to claim their queen was their sister. even if she wasn't. So technically, not every royal sibling marriage was biological incest, but a lot of them definitely were. Still, the intent was always the same. Close the loop, seal the bloodline. Now, pause, and consider something that modern scholars still argue about. How much of this was religious, and how much was pure politics? Some academics argue the sibling marriage ritual had less to do with sacred blood and more with squashing potential threats. A sister raised within the palace was a known quantity. She wasn't going to bring in rival advisors or secret agendas. Plus, she wouldn't have outside loyalties, since her family was already the royal family. So convenient. Others suggest it was actually the Queen Mother, not the king, who passed down legitimacy. The pharaoh's claim to rule then wasn't through his dad, but through his mother's divine bloodline. In that case, marrying your sister wasn't about lust or love, it was about giving your son the right pedigree to inherit. Here's a fringe fact to keep in your back pocket. The ancient Egyptian word for sister also meant beloved. Yeah, wrap your head around that. When inscriptions say a king loved his sister, they may not have meant it literally. Or they may have. The ambiguity doesn't help, especially when modern historians are trying to separate royal endearment from royal bedchambers. In the royal tombs, paintings and carvings show kings and queens walking into the afterlife hand in hand, the implication that their bond transcended death. And if you ask the court priests, they'd say that was the point all along. By marrying his sister, the pharaoh was recreating the eternal union of the gods, ensuring the balance of Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe, continued for another generation. And so the pattern repeats. Sister marries brother, their child marries a cousin. Titles shuffle like playing cards. Divinity is preserved, at least on the surface, and behind the scenes. A family tree that looks less like a proud oak and more like a Mobius strip, so you're all starting to get it now. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't even all that scandalous to them. It was a system. A symbolic, strategic, deeply weird system that kept the illusion of divine power alive for over 3,000 years. And it's only going to get messier from here. You're sitting on a sun-warmed step just outside the grand temple complex of Karnak, watching priests bustle through cloud-like incense when the story shifts to something far more personal. You're about to witness the beginning of a royal marriage, not just any marriage, but the first sibling wedding in the Egyptian record that historians believe was done openly and with all the bells and ceremonial whistles. And honestly, it's a little surreal. The bride is young, regal, wearing layers of linen so sheer they practically float. Gold glitters at her neck and wrists, and her eyes, coal-lined and unreadable, stay fixed on the horizon. She's not smiling. Her groom, tall and stiff in ceremonial armour, offers no glance of affection. He's focused on the processional line ahead. Musicians play flutes and tambourines, while dancers move in slow, synchronised sways. But under all this glamour and solemnity, there's tension. Not because this is a scandal, but because it's a shift. A public statement that from this point forward the royal family's bloodline would not be diluted. It's likely we're watching the reign of Ahmosis this, the founding pharaoh of the 18th dynasty around 1550 BCE. He's remembered for kicking out the Hyksos invaders and reuniting Egypt, but less famously he may have been the first ruler to make sibling marriage a central part of dynastic policy. His queen, Ahmose Nefertari, was not only his wife but also his sister, and their union set the tone for centuries of divinely justified incest. To the public this wasn't taboo, it was genius. It screamed unity, order, cosmic legitimacy. The gods married their siblings, and now the rulers of Egypt would do the same in plain view for all the temples and tombs to immortalise. Still, you can't help but notice that beneath the formalities this doesn't look like a love story. There are no whispered vows, no giggling flower girls, no teary parents dabbing at their eyes with cloth. It feels more like a coronation than a wedding, which in a way it is. By marrying his sister, the pharaoh isn't just taking a wife, he's declaring that his rule, his blood and his gods are unshakable. She in turn becomes something more than a consort. She becomes his twin in divinity. And this queen, Ahmose Nefertari, doesn't just fade into the background like some trophy bride. Nope. She goes on to wield significant power, appearing in temples as a goddess in her own right. Her statues stand beside her husband's. Her name is invoked in religious rites long after her death, and she's even deified, worshipped by later generations as the semi-divine being. So yeah, Marrying your brother in this world doesn't mean you're some forgotten footnote. Sometimes it means you get your own cult. Here's where the symbolism kicks in again. In the myth of Isis and Osiris, Isis literally reassembles her dead brother's body after he's murdered, breathes life back into him, and conceives their son Horus in one epic magical moment. The bond between brother and sister in Egyptian myth isn't just strong, it's cosmic. So when a pharaoh mirrors that in his own life, he's tapping into an eternal archetype. It's like shouting to the universe, I'm one of them, I'm keeping the divine loop alive. There's an open debate though, because of course there is. Some historians argue that Amos and Nefertari might not have been full siblings at all. The ancient sources are murky, and in some cases, sister might have been more of an honorific title, one used the way you might say beloved or partner, without implying anything gross. Others push back hard, citing burial inscriptions, DNA analysis, and royal titles that indicate this was exactly what it looked like, a sibling marriage at the highest level of power. Either way, the trend sticks. Their children go on to repeat the model, and the idea of pure blood becomes something of a dynasty-wide addiction. You take a stroll down a hall lined with statues and inscriptions, all carved meticulously into limestone. You run your fingers over the cartouches, oval symbols enclosing royal names, and notice how the names repeat from generation to generation. It's like they're trying to create an eternal loop, a time-proof brand that says, we were here, and we never left. And when you consider how many pharaohs were literally buried with their sister wives in matching tombs, well, that's not subtle. A quirky little nugget pops up in your research. In some tombs, archaeologists found miniature figurines of the royal couple embracing, not standing stiffly, but actually touching. This was rare. Egyptian art tends to be formal, symbolic, almost allergic to intimacy. But here and there you see a flicker of something else. Affection? Ownership? Maybe just really dedicated symbolism? Who knows? But it adds a little texture to the story. Maybe some of these sibling couples were more than just ceremonial partners. Maybe some of them found a way to make the weird arrangement work. Maybe, or maybe not. Because while the practice becomes standard, it also becomes increasingly performative. Later pharaohs start advertising their sister wives more as status symbols than actual lovers. It's like royal Instagram, except instead of soft lighting and filters, you get inscriptions on a 40-ton obelisk. The great royal wife becomes part of the official branding, regardless of whether she's actually sharing a bed with the king. Sometimes she's a half-sister, sometimes just a cousin, sometimes just a highborn noble adopted into the family for the sake of appearances. The point is not the relationship, it's the illusion of one. But back at the temple, the ceremony is winding down. The priests have finished chanting, the incense is thick. The couple stands before the gods, hands clasped, eyes forward. Somewhere a scribe is carving today's events into a papyrus scroll, ensuring the moment will echo for thousands of years, and you, watching from the shadowy edge of the colonnade, are realizing just how much power can be hidden behind ritual. This isn't just a marriage, it's a political spell, a performance of eternity, and the show is just getting started. You find yourself now in a stone chamber lit by the flicker of oil lamps, heavy with the scent of beeswax and incense. A half circle of older men in linen kilts and leopard-skin priest robes sit in solemn silence. This isn't a religious rite or a funeral, it's a royal strategy meeting, the kind where the future of an empire gets shuffled like a deck of lotus-scented cards. The topic on the table? Marriage. More specifically, why keeping power in the family, really in the family, is the best possible way to ensure Egypt's throne stays steady, divine, and conveniently free of rival claims. One of the priests clears his throat and speaks in slow, careful tones, as if he's unspooling a spell. Only one thing is more dangerous than an invading army, he says. A cousin with ambition. Heads nod all around. No one's here to fall in love. They're here to build fortresses, not from stone but from bloodlines. You shift a little in your seat, half expecting someone to call out how awkward it is that all these brilliant minds have decided the best way to protect Egypt from political collapse is to marry their sisters. But no one flinches. This isn't some scandal to be whispered about in corridors. This is statecraft. If you keep the bloodline royal, you keep it safe. If you start letting pharaohs marry nobles from rival families, you're giving those families a ticket to the throne. And Egypt doesn't play that game. The logic, as twisted as it sounds, holds up in their world. The pharaoh is divine, the queen must also be divine. Therefore, the only acceptable match is someone who shares that sacred spark. Who better than a sister raised within the palace, educated by the same priests, steeped in the same rituals, and trusted by the same power brokers? You marry out, you weaken the illusion. Marry in, and you tighten the circle of control until no one else can breathe. You glance at one of the scrolls unfurled on a cedar table. It lists the titles of royal women: Great Royal Wife, King's Daughter, King's Sister, Mistress of the Two Lands. And in many cases, the same woman holds all of them. It's a tight loop, and it doesn't leave much room for outsiders. If a nobleman's daughter did manage to marry the pharaoh, she'd never be granted top status unless she had the right family ties, which in most cases meant actual blood ties. Think of it like a divine club where the password is your family tree. One pharaoh who really ran with this logic was Thutmose III. You might know him as the Napoleon of Egypt, a military genius who led over a dozen campaigns. But behind all that battlefield glory was a careful web of marriages designed to keep his power consolidated. He married several of his own family members, likely including sisters or half-sisters, not because he was lonely, but because he knew what happened when you let other families in through the back door. Spoiler, they didn't just knock politely. But here's the twist. Sometimes those outsider families did get a foot in the door, and it usually caused problems. You sit in on another council session decades later, where a high priest is fuming because a pharaoh married a woman from a powerful noble house, and now her relatives are demanding promotions, land, and even influence in temple affairs. It's a political infection. The priest stabs his finger at a papyrus scroll and growls, "This is why we marry our own." You can't help but see the echo of the modern power dynasties here. When you centralise wealth and control, you want to trust the people closest to you. But in ancient Egypt, where rulers were literal gods on earth, that centralisation took on a feverish intensity. It wasn't just wealth they were guarding, it was divinity itself. Here's a curious little aside. There's a theory floating among fringe historians that Egypt's sibling marriage practices weren't just symbolic or political. They may have been a form of ancient eugenics. In this theory, keeping the bloodline pure wasn't about belief, it was about breeding. Now, most mainstream scholars give this a side-eye at best. After all, the concept of genetics was a few thousand years away from being discovered. But the obsession with perfection, symmetry and divine heredity does raise an eyebrow. Did they feel that physical similarity between king and queen somehow reflected cosmic balance? Maybe, maybe not, but the idea of purity is definitely stamped all over their royal propaganda. And of course, this plan doesn't always go smoothly. Sometimes sibling marriages led to weak heirs. Sometimes they led to no heirs at all. But the machine didn't stop. When one royal line thinned out, the priests and scribes got to work, stretching timelines, inventing sisterhoods, faking lineages, anything to keep the illusion intact. You don't just break the chain, you rebrand it. You step outside the council chamber now into the open courtyard of the palace and watch young royal children practicing their hieroglyphs under the eyes of stern tutors. You know some of these kids will grow up to marry each other, and it's not presented as strange, it's presented as destiny. You were born to rule, a tutor tells one of the girls, and only someone born like you can understand what it means. It's not a proposal, it's a prophecy. Still, behind the ritual and strategy there's an undercurrent of fear. You feel it. These rulers, gilded and divine though they may be, are terrified of instability. Every generation sees itself as one bad marriage away from civil war. So they close ranks, draw their lineage tighter, and sacrifice personal freedom for the illusion of eternal control. So here you are, watching a system engineered for cosmic perfection, but teetering on a human foundation. Love has nothing to do with it. Consent, even less. This is blood politics, ritualized and repeated over centuries until it feels normal. And that's the part that lingers, not the ceremony, not the titles, but how normalized it became, how marrying your own sister turned from taboo into tradition. And now that the foundations are laid, you're about to meet the royal who takes all of this and turns it into the ancient version of a full-blown family soap opera. You're now standing in the cool, dim halls of the Cairo Museum, your footsteps echoing off stone as you approach the glass case that holds a small, unassuming coffin. It's barely 5 feet long, carved with delicate gold filigree and deep blue inlays. Inside lies one of history's most famous corpses, Tutankhamun, the boy king, the golden pharaoh. The one whose tomb was discovered untouched in 1922, buried beneath centuries of sand and silence. But tonight, you're not here for the glitz. You're here for the family drama, because Tutankhamun, more than any other ruler, embodies everything that went sideways with the Egyptian tradition of sibling marriage. He was born in the dying embers of the 18th dynasty, a chaotic time when gods were being swapped, temples desecrated, and political alliances shredded. His father was probably Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who tried to force monotheism on a very not interested population. His mother? That's where things get crunchy. DNA tests done on the mummies in 2010 revealed that his mother was also Akhenaten's sister, not some distant cousin, not a noblewoman with a shaky royal connection. His full sister, same parents, same bloodline, same everything. Now you lean in closer to the boy king's shriveled remains. Scientists have done scans, DNA tests, facial reconstructions, you name it, and the results? Not flattering. Tutankhamun had a clubfoot, a cleft palate, and possibly a degenerative bone disease. His spine was curved, his skull oddly elongated. His body was so fragile some experts think he couldn't have walked unassisted. A few even suspect he was in constant pain, so yes, he was a king and technically a god, but his body bore the full weight of his family's decisions. Now imagine being this 14-year-old boy, crowned pharaoh, at an age when most kids are still figuring out how to talk to girls. Or in his case, how to marry one, specifically his half-sister Akhenaten. She was the daughter of Nefertiti, which made her Tut's cousin, maybe even stepsister, depending on who you ask. Either way, family ties were thick and tangled. Their marriage was political, sacred, expected, and likely arranged when they were both too young to protest. You picture the wedding, the lavish feasts, the priests chanting under starry skies, the twin thrones gleaming in the flicker of torchlight, and two teenagers, probably terrified, sitting beside each other like wax figures in a museum. Nobody asked them what they wanted. Nobody cared. The fate of Egypt rested on their union. But here's the sad part. Things don't go well, and Akhenaten bears no surviving children, though there's evidence she may have suffered 2 stillbirths. 2 tiny mummies were found buried in Tutankhamun's tomb, both female, both severely malformed. DNA testing confirmed they were his daughters. Neither lived more than a few days, if that. It's a heartbreaking detail, and one that underscores just how risky this obsession with blood purity really was. Royal inbreeding had consequences, and the 18th dynasty was starting to feel them in full. Tut's short reign, just under 10 years, was marked by attempts to clean up his father's theological mess. He restored the old gods, reopened temples, and tried to erase the weird sun-worshipping phase that had turned the kingdom upside down. But he was also a puppet. The real power lay in the hands of 2 men, his advisor and probably his grandfather, and Horemheb, the military general waiting in the wings like a cobra in the reeds. When Tut died unexpectedly at 19, likely from a combination of malaria, a broken leg, that whole genetic dice roll, the succession crisis hit full speed. Akhenaten, now a young widow, suddenly found herself in a terrifying position. With no surviving children, her marriage had failed its single most important political purpose, producing a male heir, and now, without a brother or son to protect her, she had no power at all. In one of the most desperate and fascinating moves in Egyptian history, she wrote to the king of the Hittites, a foreign enemy, and begged him to send one of his sons to marry her. "I am afraid," she wrote, "I have no son, but they say you have many." That's not romantic, that's survival. She was trying to save herself, and possibly Egypt, from falling into the hands of her scheming advisors. The Hittite prince did head south, but he never made it to the altar. He was killed en route, probably by or Horemheb's agents. Akhenaten disappears from the record soon after. Her tomb has never been found. Her end remains one of ancient Egypt's open mysteries. Here's where the open scholarly debate kicks in. Was Tutankhamun's death really an accident, or was it politically convenient? Was his clubfoot the result of natural chance, or a predictable outcome of centuries of sibling marriage? Some argue his physical condition has been exaggerated to fuel modern fascination. Others say it's a textbook case of recessive genes gone wild. The truth? Somewhere in between. But what's not debatable is this. Tutankhamun's short, troubled life is the clearest example we have of how royal incest may have looked divine from the outside, but inside it was eating the dynasty alive. His body tells the story, his tomb, magnificent and golden, tells the myth, but his DNA, that whispers the secret. And you realise something standing there beside his glass case. For all the grandeur, the gold mask, the chariots, the linen bandages, this was a kid born into a cursed perfection, a system that praised divine blood while quietly destroying the people who carried it. Now you step away, letting the hum of the museum fade behind you. Outside, the Nile still flows, the sun still sets over Thebes. But the legacy of that broken bloodline lingers like a shadow. And in the next chapter of our story, the sibling marriages don't stop. They just get more dramatic, more ruthless, and somehow even more dysfunctional. Welcome to the Ptolemaic dynasty, and trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. You're now walking through Alexandria, but not the one filled with sunbathers and scooters. No, this is Alexandria as it stood over 2,000 years ago, glistening like a marble dream on the Mediterranean shore. You pass soaring columns, libraries filled with scrolls, philosophers in togas quoting Plato, and somewhere, high above the harbour, the great lighthouse of Pharaohs flashes its beam across the sea. But this isn't just a city, it's a throne room for the final, and maybe most unhinged dynasty Egypt would ever know, the Ptolemies. Now, if you thought the earlier Egyptian pharaohs took sibling marriage a little too seriously, brace yourself, because the Ptolemies cranked it up to 11 and then smashed the dial. These weren't even native Egyptians. The Ptolemaic dynasty was founded by a Greek general named Ptolemy, a close friend and maybe body double of Alexander the Great. When Alexander died, his empire shattered, and Ptolemy grabbed Egypt like a juicy inheritance. The Greeks had arrived, and they were about to get real weird with it. The Ptolemies adopted Egyptian customs quickly, but sibling marriage? They didn't just adopt it, they made it their thing. You sit in on a royal banquet, golden goblets clinking, roasted peacocks on silver trays, flutes playing delicate tunes in the background. And at the head of the table, a brother and sister, dressed in matching robes, reclining on ivory thrones like minor deities. This is Ptolemy II and his sister Arsinoe II, one of the earliest and most famous sibling pairings in the dynasty. And they don't even pretend it's just for show. These marriages are formal, state-sanctioned and recorded with pride. Coins are minted with both their faces. Statues are sculpted with their arms intertwined. Inscriptions outright declare them Theoi Adelphoi, the sibling gods. Not metaphorically, literally. They're telling the public, hey, we're not just ruling together, we're sleeping together, and also you should worship us. It's bold. It's strategic. It's also disturbingly theatrical. The Ptolemies weren't interested in subtlety. They were performing incest as high art. But underneath the gold leaf propaganda, the reality was vicious. These sibling marriages weren't just symbolic, they were weapons. You skip ahead a few decades and find Ptolemy VI and Cleopatra II, another brother-sister couple who ruled jointly for a while, then tried to kill each other. She actually married her other brother when the first one died, just to keep the throne in the family. Then she married the first one again when he rose from political exile like a badly written soap opera character. There's jealousy, betrayal, attempted murder, and naturally civil war. And somehow that's not even the craziest part of the family saga. Because here she comes, Cleopatra VII. Yes, that Cleopatra, the one from the movies, the one who seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and died with a snakebite that probably wasn't actually a snakebite. What's less famous about her? She was a product of at least 9 generations of sibling marriage. By the time she takes the throne, the Ptolemaic gene pool isn't so much a pool as a muddy puddle. Cleopatra herself may not have married a sibling initially. She shared the throne with her brothers, yes, but she pretty quickly kicked one into the Nile and tried to poison the other. Later she married that surviving brother anyway, just to maintain the illusion of tradition. They ruled as king and queen, but there's no real evidence they ever shared a bed. So in her case, the incestuous label was more of a political costume, one she wore for the sake of optics, not offspring. But that's what makes the Ptolemies so fascinating. They took the Egyptian playbook and performed it with full Greek drama. Sibling marriage wasn't just about purity or power, it was about survival in a court filled with assassins, gossip, and rivals who might poison your figs. By marrying their sisters, Ptolemaic kings locked out outsiders. The throne stayed hermetically sealed. No in-laws, no rival dynasties, just endless reruns of Keeping Up with the Ptolemies. And here's the fringe fact that makes your jaw tighten. Many of these royal siblings actually hated each other. The marriages were ceremonial, yes, but the relationships, they were nightmares. Cleopatra III had her son executed. Cleopatra IV married outside the family and was promptly murdered. Cleopatra V may have been killed by her own daughter, or vanished into exile, depending on which dusty scroll you believe. It's like an HBO miniseries where every character has the same name, and none of them make it past episode 5. Scholars still argue whether all these marriages were consummated. Some say many were strictly legal contracts, symbolic alliances rather than physical relationships. Others point to children born with obvious signs of inbreeding, club feet, fused bones, cranial anomalies, and argue there was more than just symbolism going on. Either way, the damage was done. By the time Rome started eyeing Egypt like a ripe plum, the Ptolemies were running on fumes. You watch as Cleopatra VII, the last of her line, uses her wit, charm and political savvy to manoeuvre among giants. She speaks 9 languages, runs an economy and fends off Rome for a good 2 decades longer than anyone expected. But despite all that brilliance, she's still shackled to a legacy of bloodlines twisted too tight. Her son with Julius Caesar Caesarion is named heir, declared pharaoh, and paraded like a symbol of renewed divinity. But no one's buying it anymore. The magic is gone. Rome marches in. Caesarion is quietly killed. And the 1,000-year tradition of sibling marriage, born from myth and fear and power, dies with a final bloodless whimper. You step away from the chaos of Alexandria, leaving behind the echo of sandals on marble and the hiss of poisoned wine. The Ptolemies weren't just followers of Egyptian custom. They were its final act, a dynasty so obsessed with purity that they collapsed under the weight of their own myth-making. And yet, even with all that drama behind us, there's still one chamber of the palace left to explore. The secretive world behind the throne, where sister wives whispered, schemed, and sometimes ruled Egypt in everything but name. You slip past the colonnades, deeper into the palace where the marble is warmer underfoot and the air changes. Less ceremonial, more tense. Here, behind curtains and carved ivory screens, lies the royal harem. Not the seedy, pillow-strewn fantasy people tend to imagine, but a locked-down political war zone disguised as a collection of queenly chambers. This is where the sister wives live. And this is where the real game begins. The main hall is quiet, too quiet. You sense the hum of tension under every soft sandal step. Maids flit from room to room, carrying trays of wine, medicinal herbs, and secrets. The queen, great royal wife, is at the centre of it all, of course, sitting on her throne of gold-laced cedar, calm as the Nile during flood season. But she knows. Everyone knows. There are other women in the palace, and some of them are also sisters, and one of them might try to take everything. See, pharaohs didn't just marry one sister. Oh no, they often had several wives, half-sisters, cousins, high-born women from court, all forming this glittering, backstabbing constellation around the throne. The title of Great Royal Wife was the crown jewel, but it didn't always come with real security. If you bore the wrong child, if the king's attention wandered, or if the high priest decided your bloodline wasn't quite divine enough, you could be dethroned in a single scroll. You're sitting with one of these lesser wives now. She doesn't speak much, at least not aloud, but her eyes tell the whole story. She was promised glory, maybe even queenship. She was tutored in sacred rituals, taught the family's mythologies by heart. And now she waits, watches, hopes her son will rise to favour before someone else poisons her dates. Sibling marriage might have started as a way to reinforce cosmic order, but in practice it created a political ecosystem built on paranoia. Every sister wife had a motive. Every child could be the next pharaoh, or the next victim. You could be a goddess one day, a ghost the next. And the intrigue didn't stop at the inner chambers. Out in the city, the people whispered. The queen is not his true sister, one fishmonger mutters over fresh tilapia. The new one is. She is the one with divine blood. That kind of gossip, it could start a rebellion. You stroll past murals in the queen's corridor. Elegant, formal images showing her standing beside the king, presenting him with lotus blossoms, or clasping his hand as they make offerings to the gods. But in smaller, more private rooms, different images emerge. She stands alone, dressed in ceremonial robes, larger than the male courtiers around her. In one fresco, she crushes a serpent underfoot. This is not the image of a passive consort. This is a ruler in her own right. Take Queen Ta, wife of Amenhotep III and mother of Akhenaten. She wasn't his sister, but she wielded power as if she'd been born with the crook and flail in her crib. The court hated that she wasn't from a royal bloodline, yet her intelligence and iron will forced them to accept her. She ruled beside her husband, issued decrees, and may have even helped steer her son toward his radical religious reforms. She shows us that divine blood wasn't everything. Sometimes sheer political cunning was just as effective. But when a queen was a sister, the stakes were even higher. That combination gave her unmatched legitimacy, and that made her dangerous. If her son rose to power, she could become the king's mother, and in ancient Egypt, that was about as close as you could get to ruling outright without actually wearing the crown. Several sister wives managed this trick, steering policy from behind silk veils, using priestly rituals and divine pageantry to turn the throne toward their own children's futures. Yet even at the top, things were never safe. You pass a sealed door leading to the chambers of Queen Nefertari, wife and sister to Ramesses II. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens is so stunning, it might be the most beautiful in all of Egypt, bursting with vibrant reds, deep lapis blues and golden script that glows like starlight. Her status? Unquestionable. Her love story with Ramesses? Legendary. And still she disappeared from history before he died. Whether from illness, politics, or a quiet removal by a jealous rival, no one knows. Here's a fringe detail you'd probably miss unless someone pointed it out. In some temple inscriptions, queens are shown the same size as kings. Not smaller, not behind, equal. That's no artistic accident. When the sister wife had true power, the artists were told to show it. Royal propaganda wasn't just about symbols, it was visual politics. Show the queen as divine, and the people believe it. Show her with the same posture, the same crowns, the same stride, and suddenly her blood speaks louder than her voice ever could. But this system, powerful as it was, had a fatal flaw. It encouraged tunnel vision. The ruling class became so obsessed with internal alliances that it ignored growing unrest outside the palace walls. Scribes wrote panicked scrolls about taxes going unpaid, temples falling into disrepair, foreign trade thinning out like a receding tide. And yet, inside the palace, the priority remained the same: protect the bloodline, even if it meant letting the kingdom rot beneath gold-plated rituals. And still, the sister wives endured. Some whispered advice into the king's ear as he fell asleep. Some bribed priests, arranged assassinations, or manoeuvred their sons into high military positions. Others waited in silence, holding on to the belief that divine birth meant divine destiny. You pause at the door to one such chamber, its walls thick with paint, the air scented with cedar oil. You hear faint laughter behind it, low and guarded. Somewhere a queen is telling a joke, or maybe a lie. Either way, it's power in disguise. Because behind palace doors, the game wasn't just about who wore the crown. It was about who shaped the story, who whispered the right name at the right moment, and who was willing to weaponize blood, ritual, and family itself to keep hold of power. And next, you'll walk into the temples, where the priests didn't just bless these unions, but explained how the gods themselves had paved the way for them. You cross the threshold of the great temple now, where sunbeams spill in through narrow slits high in the walls, casting long stripes of gold across the columns. The air is heavier here, scented with myrrh and old stone, and everything feels carved in permanence. Priests shuffle past in ritual silence, linen robes trailing behind them like ghost tales. This is where the divine justifications are written and rewritten, where the myths that underpin Egypt's most eyebrow-raising customs are whispered behind closed doors and shouted from stone-carved rooftops. This is where the gods get blamed for everything. At the heart of this theological engine is a curious story. According to the priests, sibling marriage isn't just acceptable, it's sacred. Why? Because the gods did it first. The most important deities in the Egyptian pantheon, Osiris and Isis, Geb and Nut, Shu and Tefnut, were siblings and lovers. Their unions weren't taboo. They were foundational. They created the earth, the sky, the Nile itself. So when a pharaoh marries his sister, he's not being gross. He's reenacting cosmic balance. You sit cross-legged near the sanctuary, listening as a senior priest recites the myth of Osiris and Isis. It's romantic in a vaguely tragic mythological way. Osiris is the just king murdered by his jealous brother Set. Isis, his sister wife, searches across Egypt to gather his dismembered body parts, reassembles him with divine patience, and, through sheer magic and will, conceives their son, Horus. Its resurrection, rebirth, and really uncomfortable family dynamics, all bundled into one sacred legend. And this myth, it isn't just a bedtime story, it's the core logic behind pharaonic rule. Every king is Horus, son of the divine siblings. Every queen is Isis, consort and mother, sacred vessel of royal continuity. The priests repeat this cycle every year through elaborate temple rituals, parades, chants, and symbolic reenactments. It's not about historical accuracy, it's about reinforcing the idea that the kingdom itself is a living myth. The scholars still argue over just how real these beliefs were to the average Egyptian. Did farmers out in the provinces really believe the king was the child of sibling gods? Did they care? Maybe not. But in the temples, this logic held absolute weight. It allowed the pharaoh to rule without question. It gave structure to everything, and it sanctified sibling marriage in a way that felt almost unchallengeable. If the gods did it, so must the king. Now here's a fun fringe detail. The priests weren't just promoting these ideas through stories. They created elaborate temple architecture to reflect divine siblinghood. In some temples you'll find side-by-side sanctuaries for husband and wife deities who are also brother and sister. Offerings are made to both, hymns are sung in harmony, and sometimes statues of them are designed to be the same height, the same posture, twinning in every way. It's not an accident, it's theology in stone. You're shown one such set of statues in the inner temple chamber, deep in the House of Life where sacred scrolls are copied and guarded. Here, Isis and Osiris sit side by side, serene and identical. Their crowns differ. He wears the white Atef crown, she the throne-shaped headdress. But their bodies mirror one another. Unity. Balance. That's the message, and the priests use that message to justify every royal union that mimics the gods. Now, not everyone outside the temples is buying it. While the priesthood sees divine order, some foreign diplomats and visiting scribes see something else. Power theatre. They observe that the myth conveniently preserves dynastic control, shuts out external claims, and fortifies the throne under a blanket of cosmic nonsense. But say that too loudly in Thebes, and you might find yourself politely disinvited from future festivals, or worse. And even within the temple walls there's debate. You duck behind a column and catch the tail end of a hushed argument between two junior scribes. One insists that Horus and Set represent the true cosmic struggle, order versus chaos. The other argues that the myths are more political than spiritual, designed to keep the elite elite. It's all blood and power dressed up as eternity, he mutters, before noticing you're eavesdropping and vanishing behind a curtain. But there's no denying that the public performance of these beliefs was powerful. Every year, festivals were held where actors would play the roles of Osiris, Isis and Horus. The sacred marriage was reenacted with music, incense, and sometimes borderline embarrassing costumes. Crowds would watch as the goddess sister mourned her dead brother-husband, resurrected him, and gave birth to the king anew. It was myth and monarchy rolled into one never-ending loop. This myth cycle, became the scaffolding on which the entire concept of royal sibling marriage rested. Without it, the whole thing collapses. The priests know this. That's why they double down on every generation, reinforcing the divine mandate with more rituals, more temple inscriptions, more statues carved into rock so deep that not even centuries of desert wind can erase them. You begin to see how fear plays into all of this. Fear of dilution, fear of political infiltration, fear that without a myth to hold it together, Egypt might unravel. So they cling to the gods, and the gods conveniently keep marrying their sisters. Here's where it gets more unsettling. In certain inscriptions, kings themselves are deified alongside their queens, placed into the roles of Horus and Isis, while still alive. That means the royal sibling marriage isn't just a metaphor, it becomes literal cosmic maintenance. If the pharaoh and his sister queen fail in their roles, then the Nile might not flood, the sun might not rise, the world quite literally could break. So no pressure, right? You walk out of the temple at sunset, your robes brushing against cool stone. Behind you the priests continue their chants, praying not just for rain or fertility or a good harvest, but for the pharaoh and his sister wife to keep doing their job, embodying a divine pattern no matter the personal cost. And as the sky darkens, you start to wonder, if sibling marriage is what holds the stars in place, How long can the illusion last before the heavens crack? The morning light creeps across the stone like honey, slow and thick, as you step back into the palace courtyard. Only now it's not just any morning. It's the first day of the Hebsed festival, and today the pharaoh and his sister wife will do what gods do best. Perform their divinity in front of everyone. This isn't your average parade or temple chant. This is a full-on royal pageant, where the pharaoh doesn't just rule, he becomes Horus in the flesh, and his queen, naturally, becomes Isis. Because in Egypt, power always comes dressed in myth, and sibling marriage isn't just a contract, it's a costume. You find a spot among the crowd lining the procession path, surrounded by lotus sellers, wide-eyed children, and temple acolytes with shaved heads and nervous smiles. Drums begin to pound. Trumpets, those deep bronze crocodile-shaped ones, send out low vibrating calls. And here they come, the royal couple dressed like no human beings have any business dressing. The king is in full regalia, double crown, gold-threaded kilt, crook and flail, crossed over his chest. His sister queen walks beside him, tall and silent, in a linen gown so sheer it floats behind her like mist. Her headdress bears the throne symbol, because she is the throne, the seat of royal legitimacy, the goddess on whom kings must sit. Together they move like a single thought, practiced and perfect, performing a divine marriage that's been enacted every few years since time turned itself on. This is the living reenactment of Horus and Isis. And though you know it's theatre, you also feel it. Some part of you that isn't quite sceptical, some primitive instinct that believes ritual has weight. The people cheer, toss palm fronds, and sing hymns older than the Great Pyramid itself. And in that moment the myth feels real. But behind the spectacle, things are more complicated. The Hebsed festival was traditionally meant to reaffirm the king's right to rule, usually held after 30 years on the throne, though some pharaohs scheduled it sooner if they were feeling insecure. You know, just to give the divine batteries a little top-off. And when it happens, the marriage between king and queen isn't just background detail, it's necessary. The whole ceremony hinges on the appearance of cosmic unity. King and queen, brother and sister, Horus and Isis. Without the queen, the myth falls apart. Without the myth, so does the king. Somewhere in the shade of a temple wall you spot a cluster of foreign diplomats watching the parade with sideways glances. Their faces are carved from skepticism. One leans to the other and mutters something you don't catch, but it ends in a snort. To them, this is an elaborate pageant. Excessive, absurd, maybe even comical. But then again, they're not the ones trying to rule a kingdom through drought, rebellion and political assassination. When things start to fall apart, you cling to whatever ancient stories still make sense. You follow the procession into the temple precinct, where the sacred marriage will be symbolically sealed. There's no wedding night, not publicly anyway, but the rituals are explicit. The queen presents food offerings, water and incense, each symbolising fertility, renewal, and the union of opposites. The king drinks a sacred beer meant to strengthen him. They sit side by side on twin thrones beneath a canopy painted with stars, and behind them, a massive wall carving of Osiris and Isis, their arms around each other, eternal and eerily approving. This is where things get sticky, because while the ritual is divine on the outside, you know what's happening behind the curtain. You've seen the DNA reports, the malformed children, the fragile bones tucked inside golden sarcophagi. You know that this carefully choreographed myth has a price, and yet the show must go on. Here's a strange little fringe element. Some festivals included sacred statues of the gods being paraded through the streets, and if you looked closely, some of these statues were posed in full-on embrace. Not just arm over shoulder, we're talking full-on symbolic reproduction. Because in the minds of the priests this wasn't inappropriate. It was cosmic necessity. Life depended on the divine cycle continuing. Flood, harvest, resurrection, rule. So whether it was a god, a statue, or a very uncomfortable human marriage, someone had to play the roles. And yes, there is scholarly debate around how literal people took all of this. Did the priests really believe the rituals had to be performed by siblings? Or was it just convenient to keep power concentrated? Some say the ritual marriage was enough. It didn't matter whether the queen was a full sister or a well-positioned cousin, as long as the performance sold the myth. Others insist that biological siblinghood was essential. A ritual shortcut wouldn't cut it. After all, if the gods don't accept half measures, why should the throne? Meanwhile, the people watch in silence as the pharaoh and his queen ascend the temple steps. They're not shouting anymore, just murmuring prayers under their breath, pressing amulets to their chests. They believe this union, this staged celestial siblinghood, is what keeps the Nile from drying up, the sun from stalling, the enemies from marching in. It's absurd, it's profound, and it's terrifyingly delicate. You're starting to see the full picture now. Sibling marriage isn't just about bloodline or family pride. It's about symbolism so deeply entrenched it can't be untangled. It's about rulers who don't just wear crowns, they wear roles. And those roles come with scripts written by gods, revised by priests, and performed under the watchful eyes of a kingdom that cannot afford to question the plot. The ceremony ends with a ritual embrace, polite and distant. They turn, descend the stairs, and vanish behind embroidered curtains. Outside, the crowd begins to break apart, returning to their ordinary lives, farming, fishing, gossiping about what they just saw. And you walk away with a strange feeling. Like you've just seen two people become myths, and two myths become people, and now you're not sure where one ends and the other begins. But don't get too comfortable. Egypt wasn't the only place where the royal family tree curled in on itself. Across the ocean, high in the Andes, and out on Pacific islands, you'll find more siblings saying "I do" under the gaze of volcanoes and gods. You're still brushing sand from your sandals when the scenery shifts. The air grows thinner, cooler. Now you're standing at the top of a mountain, the sky sharp and blue above you, and terraced fields curl down the slopes like a green staircase built for the gods. Welcome to ancient Peru, specifically the heart of the Inca Empire. And yes, you're still very much in the world of royal sibling marriage. Because while Egypt may have turned it into a divine institution, the Incas treated it as something even more profound, an absolute cosmic necessity. The Inca ruler wasn't just a king, he was the Sapa Inca, the unique Inca, the literal child of the sun. His sister wife, she was called the Koya, and she wasn't just royalty, she was his celestial equal, the moon's representative on the earth. And just like in Egypt, their marriage was less about love and more about balance, cosmic, social and genetic balance, even if they didn't exactly have Punnett squares carved into their temple walls. You walk through the stone corridors of Cusco, the imperial capital, its walls so perfectly fitted you couldn't slide a razor between the blocks. Every inch of this place hums with power, and at the top of it all is a brother and sister who rule as one. Together they embody the unity of Inti, the sun god, and Mamakilla, the moon goddess. Without both, there is no balance. Without balance, the crops don't grow, the seasons lose their order, and the empire collapses into chaos. So yeah, the stakes are high. Now historians argue about how widespread sibling marriage actually was in Inca society. It seems to have been largely restricted to the royal family, and even then, not every Sapa Inca followed the rule to the letter. But when they did, the symbolism was unmistakable. The Inca elite believed in a purity that wasn't just physical but cosmic. Siblings raised together, educated in the same rituals, believed to carry the same divine light. It made sense to them. To marry outside the royal bloodline wasn't just politically risky, it was cosmologically dangerous. And you start to realise something. Egypt and Peru, though oceans and centuries apart, arrived at eerily similar conclusions. That divine rule required divine pairing, that the sacred must be mirrored in the family, that a brother and sister, if born to godlike parents, must unite to keep the universe from unravelling. You take a slow walk around the Temple of the Sun, the Coricancha, once lined in sheets of gold so blinding the Spanish conquistadors reportedly stumbled back from its brilliance like vampires from daylight. In its centre stood a golden disc said to represent Inti himself, and during religious festivals, the Sapa Inca and his sister wife would appear before it, bathed in upcoming sunlight, framed in divine light. Their marriage was more than a political move, it was the kingdom's spiritual engine. Now step over the Pacific, welcome to the Hawaiian Islands before they were a vacation brochure. Here too you find sibling marriage among the royal class, and it's not just tolerated, it's considered sacred. In ancient Hawaii, the highest-ranking chiefs, known as alii nui, often married their full sisters to preserve something called mana, a kind of spiritual authority or life force. The closer the blood bond, the more potent the mana, and the more potent the mana, the more unquestionable the rule. You stand beneath a palm-frond hut, watching as a young chief is anointed by a priest. His sister, wearing a lei of sacred flowers, stands beside him. No one in the crowd looks uneasy. There's no snickering, no scandal. This is not just normal, it's revered. To marry someone not of one's divine bloodline would be considered a loss of spiritual purity. In fact, the child of a brother-sister union in Hawaii was believed to possess the most sacred form of mana possible, so powerful in fact that commoners couldn't look directly at them. It starts to become clear, this wasn't about ignorance of genetics or lack of options, it was about control, it was about belief. The tighter the circle of power, the easier it was to preserve the illusion of divine right. And in cultures where the ruler wasn't just a leader, but a living god or demigod, who else could possibly be worthy of marriage? Some merchant's daughter? Some foreign noble? Please, the gods don't marry outsiders. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Even the Habsburgs, those famously chin-heavy European royals, practiced uncle-niece and cousin-cousin marriages well into the early modern period. Charles II of Spain, yes, that Charles, the one whose face is basically a warning from history, was the product of centuries of genetic loop-de-loops. And while technically not Egyptian-style sibling marriage, the intent was the same. Keep the power, keep the purity, avoid letting the wrong bloodline through the door. But back to ancient Hawaii, where you're watching a ceremonial dance in honour of a royal wedding. The movements are hypnotic, slow, deliberate, echoing stories that stretch back through generations. There's no embarrassment here, no awkward glances. You realise that in these societies, sibling marriage wasn't just a tool of power, it was a world view, a way to arrange the universe into something orderly, sacred, and deeply familiar. Of course, none of this means these marriages were always peaceful. Far from it. Just like in Egypt and among the Ptolemies, there were rivalries, jealousies, and political games. But even when these sibling bonds cracked behind palace walls, the myth of their sacredness held strong outside them. Because to admit they were just people, flawed, fallible, sometimes desperate, would shatter the whole divine facade. So you step back, looking at the patterns etched across continents, cultures, and centuries. The obsession with bloodline, the rituals built on sibling bonds, the public theatre of sacred unions that, more often than not, hid private tragedies. Different myths, same theme. And you begin to realise, whether under a gold-draped Egyptian sky, a Peruvian sunburst, or a Polynesian moon, the idea of sibling marriage wasn't a regional glitch. It was a global echo, an ancient reflex that whispered, keep the power close, trust only your own blood. Then, the gods did it, so must you. But what none of them fully understood, what they couldn't see through all the ritual and incense and divine titles, was that playing the gods eventually meant paying the price, especially once the bloodlines began to fold in on themselves. And soon, you'll open up the scrolls that show just how deeply the ancients misunderstood what was going on inside their own bodies. You're back in Egypt now, but you've swapped golden temples for something quieter, an archive room tucked deep inside a palace wall. Papyrus scrolls are rolled and stacked with obsessive care, their ends sealed in wax, the ink faded from centuries of oil lamps and sweaty fingers. This is where ancient physicians and scribes kept their knowledge, and you're here to ask one very uncomfortable question. Did they know? Did the ancient Egyptians understand what marrying your sister actually did to your body? Short answer, not really. Long answer, they were working with some of the oldest medical texts in the world, but genetics wasn't one of their strong suits. You kneel beside a scroll labelled the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical documents known to humanity, written around 1550 BCE. It's packed with recipes for everything from dental pain to crocodile bites, and sure, there's a little magic mixed in, spells involving ostrich eggs and crushed scarabs, but it also shows a real attempt at pattern recognition. Still, nothing here suggests they had any clue about recessive traits or genetic disorders. To them, illness came from spirits, imbalance, or offended gods, not chromosomes playing a cruel joke in the womb. They knew about heredity in the observational sense. They could see that some features, like eye colour, body type, or even certain diseases, ran in families. But the cause, that was spiritual or mystical, or maybe something vaguely explained by the soul, Ka, and life force, Ba. The idea that two parents carrying the same flawed gene could pass it on more easily to their child. That was centuries beyond their reach. So when a pharaoh married his sister and their child was born with a cleft palate, nobody blamed the family tree. They blamed fate, or the gods, or maybe an angry ancestor whose tomb offering had been skimped on. What they did notice, though, was that some royal children were different. You open another scroll and find diagrams of fetal development, probably copied from earlier sources. There are notes about miscarriages, stillbirths, infants born with no limbs or with twisted feet. These weren't hidden. Egyptians had a long tradition of confronting death head-on. They embalmed it, painted it, and prayed over it. But even with this familiarity, there's no hint that they saw a connection between their own breeding habits and these tragic outcomes. Here's where the fringe theories creep in. Some modern scholars have wondered whether any ancient physician might have suspected that sibling marriage was dangerous, that maybe there was a whisper network of midwives and embalmers passing notes about how royal babies tended to come out wrong. There's no solid proof, but you have to wonder. Did a harem nurse ever think to herself, all these babies from brother-sister pairing seem fragile? And then decide wisely to keep that thought to herself? Because here's the thing, royal babies were precious and rare. Each one was a potential god king, a little golden egg of dynastic survival. So when one was born with a deformity, the court might not react with horror but with reverence. Strange features, divine markings, physical weakness, the gods testing their chosen child. There's a kind of tragic optimism in that, a desperate attempt to see something sacred in what might simply be genetic roulette. Now flip through time again. You're watching a physician prepare a royal child for burial. Tiny, stiff, barely formed. The scribe notes the cause of death as unknown, which in this era basically means no demons visible. The body is wrapped, offerings are made, and this tomb is sealed without a whisper of concern about where it all went wrong. Because they didn't know, they couldn't know. Of course, in hindsight, it's painfully obvious. Modern researchers have conducted CT scans and DNA analyses on royal mummies, especially from the 18th dynasty, and the findings are as clear as they are grim. Tutankhamun, as we've discussed, had a clubfoot, a deformed skull, and multiple congenital conditions. His parents were full siblings. His daughters, both stillborn, were likely the result of continued intra-family breeding, and he's not alone. Royal lines across dynasties show similar patterns. Cleft palates, elongated skulls, fused joints, high infant mortality. But in their own time, this wasn't science, it was mystery. And mystery was dangerous. If a royal child died young, it wasn't a chance to revise marital policy. It was a moment for priests to dig into the Book of the Dead and find which spell had gone unspoken. And here's a curious little ritual note. In some royal births, special amulets were placed near the mother's body during labour. Amulets shaped like frogs, scarabs, or tiny lionesses. These were supposed to protect against evil spirits. But they also may have served another purpose, protecting against bad luck. Or more specifically, protecting against consequences they didn't understand but feared deeply. There's an open debate among Egyptologists even now. Was the decline of certain dynasties due, at least in part, to genetic deterioration from repeated sibling marriages? Some say yes. The evidence is there in the bodies, in the tombs, in the lineages that flicker out like candles in a sandstorm. Others say no, pointing out that war, politics, famine, and economic collapse played bigger roles. After all, ancient Egypt fell and rose many times across thousands of years, with or without royal inbreeding. But you can't help noticing the pattern. The tighter the bloodline, the sooner the flame starts to sputter. You step outside, scroll still echoing in your thoughts. The Nile gleams in the late afternoon sun. Boats drift lazily by, their sails catching the breeze. Life goes on. The people worship, build, plant. They believe their pharaoh is the living Horus, even if he limps, even if his voice shakes. And inside the palace, a new queen is being prepared for marriage. She's beautiful, she's regal, she's also his sister. Because they don't know, and even if they did, what choice would they really have? The desert wind brushes softly against your face as you stand in the shadow of a tomb. Being opened for the first time in over 3,000 years. The archaeologists are quiet, respectful, reverent, and just a little anxious as they pry away the last slab of stone. Inside, the smell is ancient dust, beeswax, linen, and something faintly sweet, like dried lotus. But beneath all that, bone, and with bone comes evidence, because tonight, Pharaohs, you're going to do something that the ancient Egyptians never could. Look their legacies straight in the DNA. As the sarcophagus is unsealed, you see the carefully wrapped body of a royal child. Tiny, fragile, perfectly preserved and perfectly doomed. The researchers begin their work, samples taken from teeth, femur and hair. And back at the lab, the results start rolling in. clubfoot, spinal curvature, severe scoliosis, cranial elongation, and again, no obvious cause of death apart from genetic disaster in slow motion. This isn't an isolated case, this is a pattern. Royal mummies from the 18th dynasty especially are riddled with inherited defects. Not all of them, of course. Plenty of pharaohs lived long, impressive lives. But when you trace the lines of inheritance, you see how repeated sibling marriage slowly turned the royal family tree into a biological trap. It didn't just bend, it broke. Tutankhamun, once again, is the headline case. His parents, likely full siblings, had both inherited recessive genes, and their union doubled the odds of those genes expressing. Tut's many ailments weren't freak accidents. They were the logical outcome of a tightly closed loop. And when he died, his children, stillborn and deformed, were buried without names. That's the moment Egypt's divine bloodline sputtered. Not just spiritually, literally. You walk through the lab's climate-controlled corridors, peering at scan after scan. CT images of bones twisted unnaturally, skull shapes distorted by genetic conditions, femurs riddled with signs of a vascular necrosis, where bone literally dies inside the body. These aren't the glorious gold-wrapped gods you see in tourist books. These are humans shaped by centuries of tradition that ignored biology in favour of mythology. And here's where it gets even darker. Some of these children weren't just sick, they were isolated. There's evidence that royal children who didn't meet physical expectations were kept hidden, perhaps raised quietly by nursemaids, or moved to temples under the pretense of religious life. They weren't discarded, not openly, but they weren't celebrated either. In a society that worshipped symmetry, health, and cosmic order, the deformed child born of divine parents was a contradiction they couldn't quite bear to look at. The fringe fact? Some mummies show signs of post-mortem corrections, jawbones adjusted, limbs repositioned, wrappings shaped to suggest a straighter spine or a less alarming skull. Whether this was for cosmetic purposes or something more spiritual, an attempt to make the child acceptable to the gods in death, it's hard to say, but the message is unmistakable. The illusion had to be preserved, even if reality was whispering something very different. Back in the tombs, you notice something you hadn't thought about before. How many royal statues look the same, not just in style, but in the actual features. The same long nose, the same wide-set eyes, the same oddly full lips. Artistic convention, sure, but could it also be habit? A family sculpting themselves into one increasingly distorted idea of perfection? There's a modern medical term for this kind of thing: founder effect. When a small population isolates itself and breeds internally, rare genetic mutations become more common. What's statistically insignificant in a large gene pool becomes dangerously frequent in a closed one. Egypt's pharaohs, through their careful preservation of bloodline, had unwittingly created a living experiment in royal fragility. You flip through a few academic papers now, the kind with tiny fonts and very dry footnotes. And even here, in the sterile language of science, you see it. Royal inbreeding didn't just produce genetic anomalies, it weakened dynasties. Fragile heirs meant uncertain succession. Uncertain succession meant civil unrest, assassinations and opportunists crawling out from under every obelisk. All because someone centuries ago said, let's keep the blood pure. And here's the big debate. Did it have to be this way? Some historians argue that sibling marriage wasn't as biologically risky as we make it out to be, at least not at first. 1 or 2 generations of sibling pairing might not cause catastrophe, but do it over 10 generations, that's where things spiral. Others say the practice might have worked just fine if ancient Egyptians had offset it with occasional outside marriages. But because the ideology was so rigid, so addicted to myth and image, they couldn't pivot. They chose symbolism over survival. And then there's a third school of thought, that the pharaohs knew something was wrong. Maybe not genetically, but instinctively. Why else would so many of them start hiding children away? Why else would priests scramble to revise lineage charts, patch holes in the myth, erase failed heirs? You don't do that unless something deep inside you says, this isn't working. Still, the performance continued, year after year, marriage after marriage, royal families folding tighter into themselves like origami that's been folded so many times it starts to tear. And Egypt, at least publicly, pretended not to notice. You leave the lab now, stepping out into the hot Egyptian sun, the white walls of the valley glowing like bone. Somewhere below your feet are dozens, maybe hundreds, of royal children who never made it to adulthood. Not because of war, not famine, but because their families believed that love, marriage, and power should only exist in the mirror. And up in the palace, a new pharaoh sits on the throne, planning a marriage that will once again circle inward. Because as long as the gods did it, humans must follow, even if it means building a dynasty on increasingly brittle bones. The sun hangs low over the palace rooftops, casting long, honey-coloured shadows across the courtyard where two teenagers are about to be married. He sits stiffly on a throne too large for him, sweat gathering under his ceremonial collar, while she, barely older, her face set like chiselled alabaster, waits for the high priest to finish the invocation. This isn't a fairy tale. There's no music swelling in the background, no exchanged glances of shy excitement. You're witnessing a royal wedding with zero romance, little ceremony, and all the weight of an empire balanced on two trembling pairs of shoulders. Welcome to the emotional core of it all, the part no inscription ever bothers to mention. She is the pharaoh's sister, or maybe his half-sister, or perhaps both. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that her blood is clean, royal, born of the same womb that gave birth to a living god. She doesn't need a dowry. She is the dowry. Her value isn't counted in cattle or gold, but in bloodlines and cosmic order. The gods are watching, and so is half the palace. If she weeps, it must be quietly. If she hesitates, she risks divine wrath. Or at the very least, the disapproval of about 500 perfectly waxed courtiers. He tries to smile, but it flickers. You can almost hear the thoughts tumbling behind his kohl-rimmed eyes. Is this my sister, or my wife, or both, or neither? Because in Egypt, marriage isn't about emotional connection, it's not about personal choice. It's a performance in a long-running play, and the audience isn't just the living, it's the ancestors, the gods, and generations yet to be born. There's no honeymoon, no poetry. The best you can hope for is a private chamber with linens that haven't been reused too many times, and maybe, just maybe, a conversation that doesn't make her want to scream, but she won't scream, she was trained not to. From the moment she could walk, she was taught how to serve in the temple, how to recite hymns, how to maintain a perfect stillness in the presence of power, even when that power has her own face. You follow her later that night as she slips into her new chambers, escorted by half a dozen attendants who speak in whispers and never meet her eyes. She's 16, or maybe 14. The records never say. All we know is she's alone now, trapped in the role of divine consort, queen of Upper and Lower Egypt, and co-participant in a marriage arranged entirely by people who will never have to live inside it. And this is what so often gets lost in the myth-making. We talk about pharaohs as gods, as icons, as mummy fodder. But beneath the gold, they were kids. Kids married off to their siblings because that's what the gods supposedly wanted. Imagine being 15 and told your future, your legacy, and your body all belong to your brother. It's not a scandal, it's your destiny. Congratulations. Historians rarely dwell here. It's uncomfortable, emotional, hard to prove, but for every ritualized wedding, there must have been silent despair. For every public festival, a private breakdown, and occasionally you'll catch a flicker of it, just a flicker, on a broken statue or a misaligned inscription, something that feels like resistance or maybe regret. Take Akhenaten, the half-sister and wife of Tutankhamun. After his death, she famously reached out to the Hittites, Egypt's rivals, and asked them to send her a husband. "I do not wish to take a servant as my husband," she wrote. Think about that. She was so desperate to avoid marrying someone beneath her rank, probably an advisor or regent she hated, that she was willing to bring a foreign prince into the throne room. It wasn't just a political move, it was a personal rebellion cloaked in formal language. Of course, the prince never made it. He was murdered before reaching Egypt, and Akhenaten disappears from the record soon after. Was she punished? Exiled? Silenced? We don't know, but her letter remains, pressed into a clay tablet in a foreign archive, a snapshot of a woman trying to claw her way out of a gilded cage. And here's a fringe fact. Some of the very queens we think of as sister wives may not have started that way. In a few cases, a woman might have been elevated after marriage, with royal records rewritten, to give the impression she was always part of the divine bloodline. In other words, incest became not just practice but propaganda. a tool of retroactive legitimacy. You walk through the palace gardens now, past fig trees and papyrus ponds, and imagine all the sister wives who sat in these same spots, pretending to enjoy the scent of lotus, while wondering what their lives might have been if they had been born to a merchant or a farmer, someone whose biggest marital stress was dowry negotiations, or whose cousin to avoid at the harvest festival. But no, she was born royal, which means she was born into the most elaborate system of arranged marriage ever devised. A system that didn't care how she felt, only who she was related to. You hear a priest nearby reciting the old myth, Isis reviving Osiris, conceiving Horus through divine magic, restoring cosmic balance through sibling love. It's beautiful, poetic, and entirely unfit as marital advice, because what no one says, what no temple inscription dares admit, is that behind every divine union was a terrified girl in a gold headdress, swallowing her voice and hoping that at the very least her brother husband wouldn't embarrass her at court. Or worse. And still, the system rolled on, because as long as the crops grew and the temples gleamed, no one cared how many royal brides had to smile through clenched teeth. The stone corridors wind downward now, narrowing and darkening as you descend from the royal halls into a cooler, quieter part of the palace. The records room, the chamber of seals, the place where names are etched not in gold or marble but in ledgers and ink. This is where the real rulers live. Not always on thrones, not always in statues, but behind the throne, beside it, and sometimes directly in front of it, wearing the crown as if by accident. These are the sister wives who didn't just marry power, they became power. And trust me, they weren't waiting for anyone's permission. You unroll a scroll bearing the name of Hatshepsut, one of the most famous women in ancient Egypt and possibly one of the most underestimated. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, half-sister and wife to Thutmose the Skeng, and when he died, the usual story should have played out. She'd fade into the background, a royal widow watching over her stepson. But that's not how Hatshepsut rolled. Instead, she grabbed the regency like a cobra by the neck and made it hers. She ruled as co-regent for a time, then had herself declared pharaoh. Not queen, pharaoh. She even wore the false beard, the headdress, the whole masculine aesthetic. She didn't just borrow power, she rewrote the rulebook. Her justification, divine birth of course. She claimed her mother was impregnated by the god Amun himself, while the real father, Thutmose Wed, was just, nearby. That royal sibling blood, a divine certificate of eligibility. She reigned for over 2 decades, one of the most stable and prosperous periods in Egyptian history. Temples were built, trade routes expanded, monuments commissioned that still leave tourists sweaty and speechless. She wasn't ruling in secret, she was ruling out loud. And what's more, her lineage, the whole tangled web of shared blood and sacred incest, helped her claim the throne. She didn't need to justify her ascent with war or marriage to a foreign prince. She simply pointed to her own veins and said, "This blood is pure, this crown is mine." Hatshepsut wasn't alone. Royal sister wives often held the title of God's wife of Amun, a role that mixed high priestess duties with significant political clout. In fact, in some dynasties, being the god's wife came with its own income, estates, and command over temple affairs. These women were not ornamental. They were power brokers, landowners, and occasionally full-on shadow governments wrapped in linen and incense. You walk now through a courtyard where one such woman might have met with foreign dignitaries while her brother husband was off campaigning. She would have stood beneath a canopy of palm fronds, attendants fanning the air, her voice calm and precise as she negotiated grain prices or dictated temple appointments. Her decisions would be recorded, stamped with the royal seal, and treated as law. Behind closed doors, she could make or break officials, manipulate priestly appointments, and, most importantly, secure her child's future. That's where the real game was played. If her son became the next pharaoh, she didn't retire, she levelled up. As king's mother, she wielded ceremonial and practical authority like a blade, sometimes even serving as regent if the child was young. And given that nearly all these pharaohs were the product of sibling marriages, the sister wife's role in statecraft was carved into the DNA of the throne itself. You find a statue fragment now buried beneath centuries of dust. Just a shoulder and part of a face, the rest long worn away, but the pose is familiar. Upright, serene, hand raised in blessing or command. A queen, a mother, a ruler. her name erased by a later dynasty, perhaps a man uncomfortable with the idea that his throne had once been protected by a woman who had slept with her brother and still outmaneuvered half the court. And here's the strange thing. The system didn't work in the eye of these women. It worked because of them. Without the sister wives, their education, their divine titles, their political savvy, the whole sibling marriage tradition would have collapsed under its own absurdity. It wasn't just about keeping bloodlines intact, it was about keeping the kingdom stable. These women weren't just marriage partners, they were co-anchors holding Egypt in place through storms of rebellion, drought, and dynastic confusion. Take Queen Tiye, wife of Amenhotep III. She wasn't even technically his sister, but she played the sister-wife role so effectively that no one questioned her. She appeared in official art as his equal, sometimes standing at the same height in the same pose. She handled diplomatic correspondence, received foreign gifts, and advised on religious matters. When her husband died, she became Queen Mother, and stayed powerful throughout her son Akhenaten's controversial reign. Her marriage might not have been sibling by blood, but it carried all the symbolism needed to pass as such. She slipped into the costume and wore it better than most. Fringe fact incoming. Some of these powerful sister wives, particularly in the later dynasties, had personal armies. Not massive standing forces, but private guards, hand-picked, loyal, trained to serve her interests. This wasn't just symbolic, it was muscle. It was a reminder to the court that behind the throne sat a woman with her own network, her own influence, and her own idea of what Egypt should be. Of course, not all sister wives succeeded. Some were outmaneuvered, poisoned, or quietly erased from history. You pass one sarcophagus that bears no name, its features chipped away. She was probably a queen once, maybe even a beloved one. But dynasties change and new rulers rewrite the past to fit their agendas. And if that past includes a woman who once held the entire royal lineage in her lap, better to chisel her out and let silence do the rest. Still, traces remain. Titles carved into temple lintels, letters to foreign rulers signed with her seal, painted frescoes showing her seated beside her brother husband, not behind him. And through these fragments, you realise the truth. Sibling marriage may have been about mythology and bloodlines on the surface, but beneath it, it gave rise to some of the most quietly powerful women in human history. And just as these women were shaping thrones from the shadows, there were others behind the curtain reshaping the bloodlines entirely, faking ancestries, inventing sibling ties, and rewriting the family tree to fit whatever narrative the throne needed next. You're in the palace archives again, but this time it's not the quiet hum of sacred scrolls you hear. It's the scratching of reed pens and the whispered decisions of men forging history from ink. You've stumbled into one of the most underrated royal arts, genealogy, or more accurately, genealogical improvisation. Because when the real bloodline got too complicated, too thin, or just plain inconvenient, Egypt's record keepers got creative. And suddenly, people who were never related became siblings, strangers became divine, cousins were upgraded, and everyone magically was descended from someone famous and God-touched. This wasn't just paperwork, it was survival. You sit with a scribe who's working late into the night. Candlelight flickers over his face as he adjusts a scroll of royal lineage, carefully smoothing over the fact that this pharaoh's wife wasn't actually his sister, but that won't matter once he's done. He adds a title here, erases a name there, swaps in a new mother entirely. By the end, it'll read like a pure line of divinely sanctioned sibling marriage. The gods will approve, or at least the priests will. Why go to all this trouble? Because legitimacy in ancient Egypt was a house built on stories, and the story had to be airtight. If a king rose to power without marrying a royal sister, he risked being seen as less than divine. Worse, an opportunist, a usurper. And in a world where everyone from palace guards to high priests was watching for weakness, your best armour wasn't a sword or a sphinx, it was a good family tree. So what do you do if you're the new guy, recently crowned, and oops, you don't have a sister? Easy, you invent one, or elevate a cousin and declare her your half-sister. Or marry a noble woman and retroactively claim she was born of your father's lesser wife during an obscure festival no one remembers. And just like that, your queen becomes your sacred sibling, your reign gets a divine stamp, and no one dares question it. Mostly because anyone who might object is suddenly invited to take a walk near the crocodile pool. This wasn't even seen as dishonest. It was necessary. Egypt's mythology was a machine that needed to be fed constantly, and if reality didn't offer up enough sibling wives or god-born daughters, then scribes would simply manufacture them. It wasn't just acceptable, it was a professional skill. One of the most fascinating examples, the reign of Ramesses II, the great builder king with more statues than grains of sand. His favourite wife, Nefertari, was often described with divine titles, but scholars still debate whether she was actually his sister. The records are vague, too vague, suspiciously vague. And while some documents refer to other wives who were probably sisters, Nefertari's origins feel like a narrative retrofit. Her role in art and propaganda was that of a goddess queen, a wife equal to the king. But her lineage is just out of reach, maybe because someone quietly buried the truth, or because the truth didn't match the myth. You move through a gallery of painted tombs, noticing how some queens are labelled king's wife, king's sister, while others are just great wife or mistress of the house. Sometimes it's a real sister. Sometimes it's a story they repeated until it became true. Titles were like costumes. Put one on and people start seeing you differently. And here's a fringe detail worth savouring. In a few cases, queens who were clearly not sisters of the pharaoh still appear in art with all the sibling marriage iconography. Same poses, same divine associations, same symmetry with the king. Why? Because by the time the chisel hits the wall, what's true has already been decided behind closed doors. Now consider this twist. Sometimes the reverse happened. If a king was born from an inconvenient pairing, say, from a non-royal woman or an affair that shouldn't have made it past the morning after, the scribes would do the opposite. They'd erase his real mother and slot in someone more useful, a sister wife, a deity-chosen consort, someone who could make the new pharaoh's existence look like part of a perfect cosmic loop instead of, a moment of human vulnerability in a linen-draped alcove. It worked both ways. Invent the sister wife when you need her. Disappear the wrong mother when you don't. The family tree didn't grow naturally. It was pruned, reshaped, sometimes grafted with branches from entirely different orchards, and if the resulting story made the gods happy and the people obedient, that was all that mattered. Scholars debate just how often this happened. Some think these adjustments were rare, exceptions not the norm. Others argue that much of what we think we know about royal relationships in Egypt is a polished fiction, layered over centuries of improvisation. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. What we do know is that nearly every major dynasty had moments where the line of succession made little sense without a little help from a creative scribe and a cooperative priesthood. You sit at the edge of a reflecting pool now, watching lotuses open in the morning light. Across the water, a statue of a queen smiles serenely, her name carved in gold, her titles glowing with divine authority. King's wife, king's sister, lady of the two lands. Was she really his sister, or just the best actress in a role that had to be filled? We'll never know, and that's kind of the point. Because at its core, sibling marriage in Egypt wasn't just about biology. It was about appearance, legitimacy, the sacred illusion. And when reality didn't cooperate, the scribes stepped in to fix it. Quietly, efficiently, permanently. But sometimes, not even the best forgers could stop what came next. When royal bloodlines collided with foreign diplomacy, and Egypt faced a terrifying question. What happens when a pharaoh wants to marry someone outside the family? You step into a grand audience hall now, where sunlight filters through carved stone latticework and pools on the polished floor like molten gold. Scribes stand at attention, guards in feathered headdresses line the walls, and at the centre of it all sits a pharaoh, tall, quiet, unreadable, considering something almost unthinkable. Across from him, a foreign emissary bows low, holding out a gift, and behind that gift, a proposal. A foreign bride, a princess from beyond the Red Sea, bearing silks, spices, and a name that doesn't belong anywhere on the royal family tree. You can practically hear the record keepers gasping into their ink pots. This is the foreign wife dilemma, and it wasn't just a social issue, it was a theological panic wrapped in royal regalia. Because while Egyptian pharaohs occasionally took wives from neighbouring kingdoms, Babylon, Mitanni, Hatti, it was never simple. These women weren't just bringing dowries, they were bringing cultural baggage, potential political leverage, and most dangerously of all, non-divine blood. See, Egypt didn't exactly play nice with the idea of equal kingdoms. In their eyes, Every other nation was somewhere on a scale between respectable allies and filthy sand pirates. The idea that a foreign woman, born outside of Egypt's sacred Nile-fed soil, might step into the palace and sit beside the god king, that wasn't just awkward, it was destabilizing. Still, politics has a way of wearing down even the most pious of traditions. When alliances needed securing, kings sometimes relented. A foreign bride would be accepted into the harem, given a new name, perhaps even a few Egyptian titles. But make no mistake, she wasn't getting the spotlight. She wasn't becoming great royal wife unless something had gone seriously sideways with the bloodline. One of the most fascinating examples, the diplomatic marriage between Pharaoh Amenhotep III and a Mitanni princess named Tutankhamun. She arrived in Egypt with fanfare, gold and official blessings, but she wasn't elevated to queen, not fully. At best, she was one of many wives. Her role symbolic and strategic. The message was clear. Welcome to the palace, but know your place. You follow Tutankhamun's imagined footsteps now, through polished halls where her name was likely whispered in cautious tones. The Egyptian court would have scrutinised everything, her clothing, her accent, her rituals. Did she know how to walk in step with the priests? Did she understand the myth of Osiris and Isis? Was she sacred enough to belong? And more importantly, could she produce a royal heir without throwing the entire divine narrative off its rails? Here's the catch. Foreign wives brought something valuable to the court: neutrality. Because they weren't part of any internal noble house, they didn't bring uncles and brothers trying to snag temple positions or start little coups. They were useful precisely because they were outsiders. Their loyalty, in theory, went directly to the king. No family politics, no inheritance drama. Just a soft-spoken buffer between the king and whatever internal nonsense was simmering that week. But there was always a trade-off. If that foreign wife's child became the heir, you had a legitimacy problem. Could a prince born of a non-Egyptian woman truly inherit the throne of Horus? The answer for most of Egyptian history was an emphatic meh, only if we rewrite some things, which they did, often. There's an amusing fringe story involving a Babylonian king who kept sending letters to Pharaoh Akhenaten asking when his daughter would finally be married off officially. Akhenaten, true to form, ghosted him. For years, he kept the princess, sure, but gave her no real status. The subtext was clear. Thanks for the gift. No, she can't sit beside me during festivals. Yes, I'm still technically married to my sister. Don't me. And this discomfort wasn't just political. It was cultural. Egyptians saw themselves as divinely chosen, the centre of the universe, the children of gods. Foreigners, no matter how rich or royal, were born outside that system. Their blood was profane, and mixing it into the sacred line of succession? Risky business. Still, sometimes it happened. Every so often a pharaoh would break tradition and fall for, or at least strategically elevate, a foreign woman to high status. In those cases, the records got very creative. Her name would be changed to something more Egyptian. Her genealogy would be adjusted. Perhaps she was the daughter of a goddess in disguise, or maybe her homeland had been blessed by Ra himself. The point was to make her fit, to pretend the divine blood didn't dilute, but adapted. You pass through the outer gardens now, where courtiers once strolled and gossiped about these foreign brides. They were often envied for their beauty and feared for their potential. What if the king favoured her too much? What if her son was raised to rule? What if the great royal wife, his sister, his cousin, was pushed aside for someone who didn't even speak the language of the gods? And here's where things sometimes turned ugly. Rumours, poisonings, quiet removals from the palace. Not all foreign brides lived happily ever after. In fact, many of their names vanished from the record entirely once they'd served their diplomatic purpose. The power they brought, soft, subtle, strategic, wasn't always enough to protect them from the storm of palace politics. But once in a while, one of them slipped through the cracks. A foreign queen with enough charisma, enough backing, or simply enough timing to secure her place. And her son, if he could be spun into a descendant of Ra, if the priests got behind him, if the scribes could stitch together just enough holy ancestry, then he could wear the crown. And maybe, just maybe, he could convince the world that his mother had always belonged here. So the dilemma continues, sister or stranger, bloodline or alliance, a pure dynasty or a flexible one. Egypt never really answered the question. Instead, it danced around it, spun myths to smooth over the contradictions, and hoped the gods were too busy to notice. But sometimes the gamble backfired. And what followed wasn't just divine confusion, it was civil war. You're standing at the threshold of a royal courtroom, the kind with soaring columns and burning torches, and you can feel the tension pressing in like wet linen. The air is heavy with perfume and politics. Something's wrong, the scribe's pens twitch nervously. The guards won't make eye contact. And at the centre of it all, slumped in his gilded throne, is a pharaoh who should have never been born. This isn't a smear campaign, this is reality crashing into ideology. The system that once seemed so perfectly divine, so cosmically tight it could never break, has done exactly that. The royal bloodline, so carefully preserved through generations of sibling marriage, has looped in on itself too many times, and now the kingdom is facing what no ritual, no myth, and no temple hymn can spin away. A ruler who cannot rule. His name is buried now, lost beneath the rewritten lists and corrected lineage charts. But his legacy, that lingers in the damage left behind, confusion, succession crises, and a kingdom unsure of who to follow next. Because when you marry your sister to keep out rivals, you eventually run out of healthy heirs. And when the heir you do get can't stand or speak clearly, or be taken seriously by his own court, the vultures don't just circle, they start landing. The whispers begin immediately. He's weak. He's cursed. The gods have turned their faces from us. In a world where the pharaoh is supposed to be a god, physical imperfection becomes a spiritual red flag. And in the gaps left by that uncertainty, ambitious generals, scheming priests and distant cousins with conveniently massaged family trees step forward to seize their chance. This is where the whole royal incest plan starts to backfire, loudly. You slip into the back of a council chamber. Tensions are high. The king's advisors are fighting, not with swords but with accusations and scrolls. One faction wants to crown the pharaoh's younger brother, stronger but only half royal. Another proposes a cousin whose mother was never officially declared divine, but whose military victories speak for themselves. And then there's the radical idea that maybe, a queen could rule outright. It's been done before, they whisper. Look at Hatshepsut. But there's one problem. No one's bloodline fits the myth anymore. Not perfectly. Everyone's got a flaw. Too common, too foreign, too female, too something. And the myth, it doesn't bend well, it breaks. So what happens next is a slow, smouldering unravelling. You hear it first in the temples, where priests start omitting certain names from prayers. Then in the streets, where people begin saying the flood is late this year, not because of weather, but because the pharaoh must have done something wrong. The crops suffer. Trade slows. And soon, power isn't just slipping from the palace, it's being yanked. Here's a fringe fact to sit with. There's evidence that at least one dynasty collapsed under the weight of its own lineage, not just from poor leadership or invasion, but because the royal family literally ran out of viable heirs. The remaining candidates were too young, too sick, or too contested. The people lost faith. And once that happened, no gold mask or sacred bloodline could pull things back together. You pass through a courtyard that's eerily quiet. Once, this was the site of coronation festivals. Now it's filled with stone benches, empty thrones, and inscriptions half chiselled then abandoned. A statue of the pharaoh has been toppled, not out of rebellion, but because no one could decide whether to finish it or smash it. He wasn't murdered. He was erased. A slow-motion assassination by history itself. In the aftermath, the court tried to recover. They picked someone, a cousin maybe, or a distant relative who was easy to manipulate, and propped him up like a scarecrow in ceremonial robes. But by then the damage was done. The people didn't buy it. The gods allegedly didn't bless it. And the throne, once secured by sister wives and sacred marriages, was now vulnerable in ways no one had dared imagine. You sit beside a low stone altar, where offerings have stopped arriving. The high priest of Amun walks past, his eyes tired, his voice hoarse. He's been reciting the same divine names for 30 years, but even he can't pretend anymore. The divine order isn't holding, because the bloodline they worked so hard to protect has finally betrayed them. This is the open secret that historians argue over today. Some say royal incest caused dynastic decay, directly contributing to Egypt's political fragmentation. Others argue that's too neat a conclusion. After all, plenty of dynasties fell without a single sibling marriage in sight. Civil war, famine, foreign invasions, those were the real culprits. Maybe. But there's no denying this. The more closed off the bloodline, the more fragile the dynasty became. not just biologically, but socially. The insistence on purity meant fewer alliances, fewer options, fewer backups when things went wrong. And when they did, boom! You've got a pharaoh who can't walk, a court that won't follow, and a kingdom that no longer believes in the story it's been told for centuries. The public response? Predictable and brutal. Statues defaced, names scratched off monuments, tombs abandoned mid-carving. The palace murals that once showed proud brother-sister couples now crumble, the gold leaf peeling like sunburn. No one wants to remember the ruler who came last, who broke the myth, who exposed the truth. And the sister wife? She vanishes too, quietly, without scandal or ceremony. Maybe she was sent to a temple, maybe she died in childbirth, maybe she saw the whole thing falling apart and chose exile. Her name, like his, is left off the official list. Her story ends in parentheses, or maybe not at all. You step back into the sun, and the palace looms empty behind you. Once it was the heart of divine order. Now it's just a building. The divine bloodline, the one so carefully kept in the family, has run out of places to go. And what follows is a new kind of myth. A curse. A belief that maybe, just maybe, the gods are punishing Egypt for pushing the boundaries of purity too far. For folding the bloodline over itself so many times, it strangled the very kingdom it was meant to protect. You're standing in a dusty village now, far from the marble halls and gold-flecked palaces, where Egypt is less eternal splendour and more cracked pottery, lazy goats, and old stories whispered between reed-thatched roofs. This is where history goes when it retires, into the memories of fishermen and farmers, healers and grandmothers who don't care about dynasties but remember the old rumours. And here, in the shade of a fig tree, someone mentions it casually. The divine egg is cursed. You pause. The what? The divine egg, they repeat, eyes squinting. The pharaohs born of their sisters, their blood was too thick with gods. It sounds like folklore. Probably is. But it hangs in the air with the same stubborn weight as smoke that won't rise. The story changes depending on who tells it. In one version, the curse began when a king defied the gods by taking a wife from his own bloodline twice, once for power, once for pleasure, and the gods punished his line by twisting his descendants into ghosts of kings. In another, the egg itself was a metaphor for the royal womb, so saturated with divine essence that no mortal child could survive in it. Either way, the meaning's the same. The closer you get to godhood, the more fragile your body becomes. You walk along the canals as dusk falls, listening to the songs drifting from tiny mud brick homes. One of them tells the tale of a child born without breath but wrapped in gold all the same. Another speaks of a queen who gave birth to 4 stillborn sons, each one buried beneath a different corner of the temple, as offerings to a sky that never thanked her. People here don't know the DNA evidence or the CT scans, but they've absorbed the legacy all the same. Something about royal blood went wrong. And here's the twist. This belief didn't just survive, it flourished. In the centuries after Egypt's golden age faded, stories about cursed kings and broken bloodlines exploded like desert blooms after a rare rain. They appear in Coptic Christian folklore, Islamic folk tales, Greco-Roman histories, even 19th century travel journals. One particularly persistent tale claims a moon-born pharaoh was so malformed he was hidden for his entire reign, issuing decrees through his sister while confined in a darkened temple chamber. Is it true? Highly unlikely. But the fact that people believed it says everything. Because once you remove the divine veneer, all that's left is a very human horror that a system designed to protect power ended up weakening the very people it elevated. And the idea that this might have been known, not by scientists, but by people who lived close to the ground, who saw the stillbirths, the coughing heirs, the queens who aged too quickly or vanished too soon, that's what fuels the legend of the divine egg. The term itself appears nowhere in official inscriptions. You won't find it in temple walls or royal tombs. It lives in the oral margins, passed on like a secret curse. Too dangerous to write down, but too compelling to forget. Some versions say the egg cracked. Others say it never hatched. A few say it still exists, hidden in a sacred vault, watched over by blind priests, glowing faintly with a golden light that no one dares touch. But even without the egg, the symptoms were everywhere. You stroll through the ruins of a smaller palace, a royal retreat turned museum for ghosts. The inscriptions are faded, but you can still make out the faces, children with oddly swollen skulls, eyes too far apart, limbs carved just a bit too short. These aren't the idolised forms of divine rulers. These are attempts to depict real bodies, bodies affected by the generation after generation of incest, and the fact that the artist didn't correct them says something strange. Either no one noticed, or they thought it was normal. And then there's Akhenaten, the heretic king, the sun worshipper, the radical reformer. His art famously shows him with elongated features, narrow limbs, wide hips. His children too are depicted with alien skulls and sloped shoulders. Was this a stylistic choice, a religious statement, or was it truth? One theory argues that the so-called Amarna style wasn't symbolic, it was honest, that the royal family really looked like that. And if that's true, then the divine egg wasn't just a curse, it was a mirror. Fringe detail. Some local legends claim the Nile itself rebelled during these cursed rains, that the river flooded too much, or not enough, that crocodiles grew bolder, that birds stopped nesting along the banks. No weather records survive to back it up, but again that's not the point. People believed that the land knew, that it responded not to politics or war, but to something deeper, the sickness of the blood. And as you walk through the necropolis at night, wind brushing the sand into soft hisses, you understand why the story's stuck. Because what's more terrifying than a god who dies like a man, or a queen whose womb turns to dust? What's more haunting than a golden dynasty that collapses not from enemy swords, but from its own reflection? The legend of the divine egg became a shorthand for everything that had gone wrong, a way to explain the slow decay of a civilization that once claimed to hold the secret to eternity, and whether the people knew the science or not, they felt the consequences. They saw the coffins growing smaller, the statues showing fewer heirs, the priests holding longer silences in their prayers. You leave the village with the words still ringing in your ears. They married their own blood, and the blood turned to sand. Because at some point, even the greatest empire has to ask itself, not just what it believes, but what it's willing to risk for the sake of that belief. And sometimes, the cost is written not in stories or monuments, but in the bones of its children. The temple floor is cool beneath your feet, smoothed by centuries of ritual. The columns rise like tree trunks in a forest of stone, but today, no chants echo through the sacred halls. No festival banners flutter in the breeze. Today something different is happening, something rare and dangerous. A royal wedding is about to take place and the bride is not the king's sister. She isn't even a cousin, she's a commoner. And with this one decision, everything Egypt thought it knew about power, purity and divine inheritance is about to be tested. You stand near the back of the crowd, watching the reactions ripple through the gathered officials like a sudden wind. Some are stiff with disapproval, others whisper behind jewelled hands, and a few, those with nothing to lose, watch with interest, sensing change. The groom, a newly crowned pharaoh from a complicated line of succession, is young, popular, and dangerously idealistic. The bride? She's beautiful, sure, but she's not of the blood. Her family farms barley near the delta. Her father's name appears nowhere in the Book of Kings, and her DNA, for once, is gloriously ordinary. The ceremony proceeds anyway. The priests perform the rites, but their voices lack the practiced zeal you've come to expect. The high priest of Amun pauses just a beat too long before reciting the lineage blessing, and when he reaches the part about divine balance through sacred unity, he quietly omits the word sister. A few eyes narrow, one hand tightens around a staff. This might look like a wedding, but it feels like an earthquake. Why now? Why break with thousands of years of tradition? It starts with exhaustion. Egypt's royal line had by this point begun to fray. Too many deaths, too few viable heirs. The previous pharaoh, old and childless, had left the throne to his general, whose blood was noble but not divine. That general then married a distant niece, hoping to repair the lineage, but she died in childbirth. And now, with no surviving sister, no cousin close enough to fake it, the throne sat empty until a young, noble-turned royal candidate stepped forward with a new idea, a radical one. What if divine rule didn't have to mean incest? What if the gods would bless merit over blood? It was heresy, it was revolutionary, and it was the only option left. The new queen, let's call her Naya, though her real name is long lost, stepped into the role with more grace than anyone expected. She studied temple rituals, she learned sacred dances, she mimicked the tone and bearing of queens past, And perhaps more importantly, she gave the people something they hadn't seen in a while: hope. She didn't bring the threat of a rival noble family. She didn't come from palace politics. And when she gave birth to her first child, a healthy boy by all accounts, there was a kind of stunned silence throughout the kingdom. No deformities, no misshapen skull, no need to adjust the tomb mask to hide a cleft palate. Just a baby. A royal baby, born of an outsider. And here's the twist: the people loved it. Outside the court, the reaction was warmer, almost celebratory. Commoners saw themselves reflected in her. Market stalls in Thebes started selling tiny clay figures of the queen holding a baby with normal limbs and no royal wig. Fishermen named their daughters after her. Priests tried to adapt. Some even began suggesting that maybe the gods had chosen her precisely because she wasn't royal. That perhaps divine favour didn't require a tangled family tree after all. But not everyone celebrated. Behind palace doors, the backlash brewed. Traditionalists in the priesthood saw this as blasphemy. They whispered that the Nile would recede in protest, that the harvest would fail. And when a drought hit 2 years into the rain, guess who got the blame? Not the weather, not the irrigation systems, Naya. Suddenly, temples started reintroducing older statues of sister queens. Old myths were dusted off and recited at public festivals with new intensity. Remember Isis, the priests would say. Remember balance. The pressure grew, and so did the paranoia. Here's a curious fringe rumour that emerged decades later. Naya's second child, a girl, was betrothed to a young man rumoured to be a distant cousin, possibly even a forged royal descendant. Why? Because even as her husband tried to modernise the monarchy, palace officials quietly worked behind the scenes to restore the old ways. If they couldn't get rid of the queen, they could at least make sure her bloodline folded back into itself eventually. Meanwhile, Naya's own position grew unstable. She'd played the role well, but the system she'd disrupted began to push back. There were rumours of poison, of a miscarriage that wasn't an accident, of divine dreams experienced by high priests insisting the gods demanded a return to sibling marriage. Whether or not those dreams were real, or conveniently fabricated by ambitious temple scribes, Naya knew her time was running short. She died young. Not suspiciously exactly, not openly, just quietly, an infection, or grief, or maybe the slow erosion of being told again and again that you don't belong on the throne you helped save. Her tomb, modest compared to those of the sister queens, contains a few worn inscriptions. No grand lineage, no divine parentage, just her name and a phrase that reads, "Beloved of the people." A soft, defiant legacy. And her son? He ruled for years. The records say he was well-liked, healthy, even-handed. But when his time came to marry, guess what the court insisted on? A cousin, a niece, someone just close enough to count. The old system, battered but not broken, clawed its way back. Because change in Egypt was never permanent. It was a ripple on the surface of the Nile, brief, beautiful, and gone before it reached the delta. But for a moment they tried something different. And in doing so, they exposed the truth the gods never wanted anyone to say out loud. Maybe the blood didn't matter. Maybe power could be shared without myth. Maybe divinity wasn't in the family tree, but in what you did with it. You leave the palace behind and follow the winding streets out toward the city's edge, where the air is less perfumed and the people speak freely. This is where truth lives, beneath woven awnings and half-whispered jokes, where bread is traded, sandals are mended, and nobody's pretending that pharaohs are literal gods. Tonight you're pulling up a seat beside the fire with the farmers, the boatmen, the women selling beer and onions, and you're going to hear what they really think about all this sibling marriage business. Spoiler, they're not impressed. They know, of course they know, Egyptians weren't stupid. They built wonders that defied time and death. Do you really think they couldn't connect a few dots about inbreeding? Even if they didn't know the word, they'd seen what happened when the royal blood stayed too close. Fragile princes, sickly babies, queens who gave birth to nothing at all. People noticed. They just didn't always say it out loud, at least not near a palace wall. But out here, in the markets, in the kitchens and riverbanks and temple back entrances, they talked. Oh, did they talk? I heard the queen married her brother, someone says, rolling her eyes as she dips flatbread into lentils. Again. And he's got a limp, another adds, lowering her voice but not her judgment. Same as the last one. The gods must be tiered. They laugh, not cruelly, but with that sharp edge only peasants can afford. These are the people who keep Egypt running, the hands that feed it, build it, bury it. And while they bow when the royal bark passes, they bow with their backs straight and their thoughts untouched. Here's the thing no one puts on temple walls: public opinion matters. Not because the pharaoh needs votes, he doesn't, but because if enough people stop believing in the myth, it loses its power. And once the myth fades, it's only a matter of time before someone in sandals, not sandals inlaid with jewels, decides they could do the job better. So what do the people actually believe? Well, it depends. Some cling to the old myths out of habit. The gods married their sisters, they say. That's how the world works. To them, every cracked tooth and crooked toe in the royal family is just divine mystery, too holy to question. Others, not so much. I think it's nonsense, one brickmaker mutters. They marry their sisters so no one else can tell them what to do. There it is, the truth under the incense. People saw sibling marriage not as sacred but as selfish, a way to keep power in the family, not to preserve cosmic order but to avoid sharing. The myth? That was just the perfume sprayed over the whole thing. And the real kicker? Some Egyptians were jealous. Not because they wanted to marry their own siblings, absolutely not, but because the royals got to bend the rules. Everyone else had to marry who their parents arranged, follow the dowry laws, behave, live sensibly. Meanwhile, the king could pick his sister, throw a festival, and be praised for it. Divine privilege, they called it. Divine arrogance, more like. Still, that jealousy didn't last long once the consequences became visible. Word spread fast about royal children who didn't live long enough for their naming rituals. There were midwives who quietly whispered that it was too much sameness in the blood, and old grannies who tutted and mumbled spells to ward off inherited curses. They weren't scientists, but they knew patterns, and they knew enough to say, "We don't do that in our house." You pass by a shrine to Hathor, goddess of love and motherhood, and see an offering of pomegranates and wine. Someone's praying for fertility, for healthy children. They don't want royal blood, they want strong blood. It's a quiet rebellion, choosing survival over sanctity. And every now and then the people get bold. A street performer recites a comedic poem during festival week, poking fun at a pharaoh's strangely shaped head. Born of 2 crowns, but no chin, he crows, and their crowl roars with laughter until the guards show up. He vanishes. No one says his name again, but the story? It spreads like fire. Fringe fact. In some districts, local priests actually downplayed the sibling marriage angle when preaching to commoners. Too much focus on divine incest, they found, and people started questioning the whole system. Better to talk about Horus slaying Set than Isis loving Osiris. You want inspiration, not queasy side-eyes. And yet, for all the snide comments and secret doubts, the people still showed up for coronations. They still cheered when the royal boat passed. They still whispered prayers when the king's name was carved into a new obelisk. Because myths aren't just believed, they're needed. They hold things together. They make suffering noble and obedience sacred. But when the balance tips, when the royal family gets too strange, too fragile, too removed, something shifts. You walk past a group of children playing pharaoh and priest, and hear one of them shout, "I am king, I marry nobody, just the gods," and another replies, "You married your donkey," followed by giggles and foot chases. That's how myths die, not with rebellion, but with laughter. The next generation stops taking it seriously, and once that happens, no amount of divine ceremony can patch the hole. By now, it's night. Oil lamps flicker. The Nile hums its eternal lullaby. The peasants have gone home, but their voices linger in the air, soft and steady. Let the kings marry who they want. We'll marry for strength, not beauty, not holiness, strength. Because they live in the real world. The one where fields flood or don't, where children live or don't. And while the pharaohs spin their myths and marry their sisters, the people keep watch, quietly, patiently, shaking their heads and waiting for the next royal child to limp down the palace steps. You're moving through chambers of polished stone now, silent and shimmering with torchlight. And everything here feels curated. Every painting, every carved relief, every little ivory trinket carefully arranged to say one thing. Power is a man's game. But just beneath the surface, if you look closely, another truth starts to pulse through the walls like a heartbeat. Behind so many of these pharaohs, these golden statues and carved muscles, stood a woman, not just a wife, not just a sister, A queen with her own agenda, her own palace guards, her own network of spies and scribes, all wrapped in the silk of sisterhood and sealed with a smile. You've already met the likes of Hatshepsut and Ta, but tonight you're stepping into the realm of those who operated in the shadows. Women who took full advantage of the incest system not because they loved their brothers, but because they saw it for what it was, a loophole, a way to grab power with both hands while everyone else was too busy pretending it was about sacred tradition. You push open a cedar door and step into the private quarters of a queen whose name you won't find etched in bold hieroglyphs. Her titles were ceremonial, her public image carefully constrained. But here in this chamber, she ran the empire. She was the king's sister, yes, but she was also his advisor, his keeper, and, when necessary, his replacement. It worked like this. As long as she kept up appearances, played the pious wife, bowed in public, bore children, she could do almost anything. She negotiated alliances through temple networks. She bribed palace guards. She decided which brother got promoted and which was mysteriously reassigned to Nubia. And she did it all from a velvet couch beneath a painted ceiling surrounded by lotus oil and gossip. You might imagine these queens as tragic figures, forced into marriage with men they didn't choose. And sure, that was part of it. But many of them turned that trap into a throne, especially in dynasties where the male heirs were sickly, absent, or just plain useless. When the king was too young or too weak, who stepped in? The great royal wife. Always. And if she happened to be his sister, even better. No one questioned her loyalty, not because they trusted her, but because they had to. Take Cleopatra, yes, not the Cleopatra, but one of her predecessors. She was a Greek princess who married into the Ptolemaic dynasty and later ruled as regent for her young son. She wasn't born into sibling marriage tradition, but she stepped into it like it was tailored for her, and once her husband died, she wielded authority so seamlessly that her brother-in-law didn't even bother trying to challenge her. Why? Because she had the bloodline and the brains. And let's not forget the queens who didn't just influence power, they created it. Some scholars believe that the office of God's wife of Amun evolved specifically to give royal women control in a system that technically didn't allow them on the throne. It began as a ceremonial role, chant this, pour that, but eventually it became a title of enormous clout. These women had their own lands, their own wealth, their own bureaucracy, and many were sister wives of the pharaoh, given this sacred office as a kind of public reward for being privately indispensable. One such queen, she's only referred to in surviving texts as the beloved of Amun, used her temple network to place allies in key roles, shift temple resources to her preferred projects, and reportedly even interfered with succession planning. When the king died unexpectedly, her chosen heir, conveniently her son, ascended within hours. The army supported it, the priests nodded, and the scribes? They rewrote the official story by morning. Here's a fringe fact. In one preserved letter found tucked in a worker's tomb, a stonemason complains that the queen has ordered changes again to the wall plans, third time this moon. It's a rare informal glimpse of how much direct control some of these women wielded. Not suggestions, not ceremonial input, orders. You step into another hallway, this one lined with relief showing queens performing rituals usually reserved for kings, offering to deities, slaying symbolic enemies, even wearing the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. These aren't accidental inclusions, they're quiet proclamations. I was here, I ruled, don't let the statue fool you. The sister wife system, flawed as it was, gave these women legitimacy. They didn't need to marry into the bloodline, they were the bloodline. And if their brother-husband faltered or died young or fell into political traps, well, who better to steady the throne than the woman already seated beside it? And sometimes that power became dangerous. There are stories, some whispered, some etched in delicate lines, of queens arranging for brothers to fall ill, or conveniently guiding their more pliable siblings toward marriage, while others were encouraged to take priestly vows or conveniently vanish into the military frontier. It wasn't just survival, it was strategy. These queens weren't passively divine, they were politically feral, brilliant, ruthless, wrapped in incense and embroidered silk. The world saw a wife, the kingdom felt a ruler. Now you return to the present, walking through museum galleries lined with statues of these queens. They stand beside kings, smaller in size, but not in presence. The plaques focus on their titles, their marriages, their children. What they don't say is how much of Egypt's golden age rested not on the shoulders of their brothers, but on their own. Because when the gods gave Egypt sibling marriage, they gave the throne a loophole, one that clever women learned to step through. And as we move forward, you'll see how this power, once wielded so carefully behind closed doors, started to wane when certain scholars and emperors began peeling back the layers and asking questions they were never supposed to ask. You're standing in a modern excavation tent now, somewhere in the dust-swept canyons of the Valley of the Kings, and the scene couldn't feel more different from the gilded halls of old. Instead of linen-clad priests, you've got khaki-shirted archaeologists. Instead of incense and chants, it's all plastic gloves, cotton swabs, and the low murmur of academic debate. But what's happening here is every bit as sacred, because they're exhuming truth. And this time the gods don't get to curate the narrative. The tomb in front of you has been sealed for over 3,000 years. The walls are painted with careful murals, gods receiving offerings, the pharaoh smiting chaos, the same mythic dance you've seen 100 times before. But it's what's inside that matters now. The remains are delicate, bones more brittle than parchment. The air around them smells of resin and ancient linen. And with one small sample taken from a molar, centuries of tightly guarded secrets start to unravel. You follow the scientists into the lab, where the DNA extraction begins. It's a slow process, careful and quiet. No dramatic Indiana Jones moments, just patience, protocol and tiny fragments of genome being pulled from royal marrow. And when the results finally come in, you brace yourself, because you know what they're going to say. The pharaoh was the child of siblings. Again, and not just any pharaoh. This one was celebrated, even revered, a restorer of temples, a builder of monuments. But his bones tell a different story. Scoliosis, a twisted knee, evidence of arthritis in his 20s, a jaw misaligned just enough to cause lifelong pain. And here, on the digital report, is the phrase that keeps showing up like a divine whisper turned warning. Homozygous recessive mutation. In other words, he inherited the same defective gene from both parents, because they were too closely related. Now let's pause. DNA doesn't lie, but it also doesn't offer the whole story. One of the ongoing scholarly debates centres around what really caused the visible defects in royal mummies. Was it inbreeding, malnutrition, disease, the embalming process itself? Some argue that we might be overinterpreting the data, applying modern logic to an ancient world. Fair point, but the patterns are hard to ignore, especially when you line up the family trees. In the 18th dynasty alone, sibling marriage wasn't just common, it was systemic. Akhenaten and his sister, Tutankhamun, their son, Akhenaten, Tut's half-sister and wife. On and on it goes, like a looped melody with increasingly warped notes. You don't need a double helix diagram to see that something was spiralling. And here's where it gets grim. Some of the most visually stunning tombs belong to people who barely made it into adulthood. Carved with epics, painted with journeys into the afterlife, yet buried by 1922-24 at best. Their skulls show signs of congenital anomalies, their leg bones bowed, their teeth often missing or never fully formed. These weren't just the unlucky few, they were the norm. You step into the next chamber, where a full CT scanner sits humming. Inside it, the wrapped remains of a royal woman, sister wife, queen, mother of a pharaoh. Her bones show signs of pregnancy, several, in fact. But her pelvis also reveals signs of severe trauma, possibly from repeated childbirth complications. She died young, probably before 30. Her name is half erased on the tomb wall. No grand epitaph, just a cartouche with smudged ink. Fringe fact, researchers recently discovered that many mummies previously assumed to be male were actually female, misidentified by early archaeologists because of the masculine roles they held. That includes a few high-status sister wives, which means that for years we've been studying their legacies through the wrong lens, missing their influence, their pain, and their place in the genetic web of the royal house. Now you walk over to a display table covered in documents, some ancient, others modern, birth records, titles, medical notes, gene sequencing charts. One researcher points to a section of double-lettered chromosomes and mutters, "That right there? That's why he couldn't walk." Another adds, "We're still not sure how he survived as long as he did." And the conversation continues, each scholar building on the last, weaving science into mythology and pulling secrets from bone dust. The open question, how much did the ancient Egyptians know? Some think they were blissfully unaware, too steeped in religion to notice the genetic consequences. Others suspect they did know, at least on some level, but the weight of tradition, myth and divine symbolism was too heavy to challenge. After all, when you're told that your family tree was planted by the gods themselves, who are you to question its shape? But modern science is relentless. It has no patience for ceremony. It doesn't care how many priests blessed your union or how many scarabs were placed on your chest. It looks at your DNA and reports without judgment that the sacred bloodline you thought would last forever was actually laced with quiet destruction. And yet somehow that bloodline persisted for centuries. Against all odds, against biology, against reason. Maybe it was stubborn faith, maybe it was sheer political will, or maybe the human body is more forgiving than we think, able to endure generations of genetic pressure before finally cracking. You step back into the heat of the day, the lab behind you, the tombs still stretching into the hills. Egypt didn't die from sibling marriage, but it bled from it, slowly, quietly, generation by generation. Now the bones are speaking, and their stories are being heard not in temples, but in labs, not by gods but by scholars. The question isn't whether royal incest existed, that's settled. The question is what the ancient world was willing to sacrifice in order to keep the illusion alive. Now you're in a room full of glass cases and velvet ropes, somewhere in the echoing corridors of a modern museum. The kind with buzzing lights, audio tours and plaques written by scholars who try to cram 4,000 years into 4 neat paragraphs. It's quiet here. The air a little too cold, the floors a little too shiny. But as you walk past the exhibits, each one dedicated to Egypt's mighty rulers, you realise you're surrounded by ghosts dressed in gold, and not one of them is telling you the whole truth. Here's Tutankhamun, King Tut, perhaps the most famous of all. His golden death mask stares out with those serene blank eyes, as if he's keeping a secret behind his smile. People flock to see him, to marvel at the jewellery, the chariot wheels, the statues of gods packed around his tiny coffin, but most of them don't know that inside the mask was a body ravaged by scoliosis, a clubbed foot, and probably malaria. Nor did they know he was the product of a full sibling union, Akhenaten and his sister, the very epitome of the divine bloodline dream. And yet he ruled for only 9 years and left behind no surviving heirs. You stand in front of his case now and it hits you. This was a boy who never stood a full day without pain. A god king who probably limped through every ritual. His burial was rushed. His tomb was small, reused, almost like no one expected him to live long enough to need it. And yet, we call him a wonder. Maybe not because of what he did, but because of what he reveals. Across the room, another case holds jewellery worn by a queen. Her name is faded, partially lost, but her titles are intact. Great wife of the king, sister of the king, mother of the king, triple duty, triple pressure. And somewhere between the lapis amulets and ivory combs, you remember that these weren't just ornaments, they were armour. Ritual defences against a system that asked women to marry their brothers, bear their nephews, and rule in silence. This is where Egypt's legacy starts to feel less like myth, and more like theatre. Each artefact is a prop, each inscription a script. The pharaohs weren't just rulers, they were actors in a role written by gods and recited endlessly, generation after generation. But off stage, the real drama played out in bone and blood. And the audiences? Us. Always watching, always revering, rarely questioning. Let's zoom out for a second. The royal incest practice of Egypt wasn't unique. The Ptolemies, the Greek rulers who took over after Alexander the Great, doubled down on it centuries later. Cleopatra VII, the famous one, married 2 of her brothers, not romantically, not even practically. It was strategic. She ruled solo in many ways, but kept up the sibling marriage facade because it still worked as political glue, even when everyone knew better. That's the legacy Egypt left behind, not just the structures and statues, but the idea that divine rule requires control over the family tree. That purity, whatever that means, must be maintained, even at the cost of health, choice, or sanity. Fringe fact, a surprising number of 19th century European monarchs cited Egypt as justification for their own inbreeding practices. Cousins marrying cousins, nephews taking their aunts as brides, all in the name of dynastic continuity. They pointed to the pyramids and said, "See, they did it, and look how long they lasted." Never mind that the last true Egyptian dynasty collapsed under internal strain. foreign takeover, and a dwindling pool of heirs who could physically survive childhood. Back in the museum, you reach the sarcophagus of a lesser-known pharaoh. His name is barely remembered, his reign short, his statue unremarkable. But the DNA records list him as the son of a half-sister marriage, born into a line where the gene pool was already stretched thin. His mummy shows fused joints, poor dental health, and one leg 2 inches shorter than the other. This wasn't a king in the chariot. This was a king who probably needed help standing during public rituals, and the plaque just says, "Son of the sun god, long live the king." It's hard not to feel a chill at that. But here's where things get strange. Despite all the evidence, scientific, visual, cultural, the myth of ancient Egypt as a land of perfection still holds. People don't want to see the flaws. They want the gold, the mystery, the drama. They want the pyramids without the pain, the divine rituals without the diseased children, the love stories without the gene rot. Maybe that's what makes Egypt so enduring. Not because it was perfect, but because it never stopped performing perfection. Even when the bloodline broke, the statues stood. Even when the last royal child was born too frail to breathe unaided, the gods were still carved in stone as if nothing had changed. You circle back to the exit, passing a replica of the Temple of Karnak. Giant pillars rise like tree trunks into a false sky. Tourists pose, kids run between the shadows, but above it all is the silent face of a king carved into stone, smiling that same unreadable smile. You can almost hear him whisper, "I was married to my sister. I was worshipped like a god. I couldn't walk without a cane by 15. And still, you remember me." That's the paradox of Egypt. It asks you to admire what was built while ignoring what it cost. And that cost? Generation after generation, buried beneath limestone and gold leaf, was paid by the very people who were supposed to be divine. The king, his sister, their children, again and again and again. You're standing at the threshold of 2 worlds now, one steeped in the incense and limestone of ancient belief, and the other bathed in fluorescent light and museum glass. You've followed the arc of the story from gilded coronations to genetic collapse, from sacred unions to whispered regrets. And here, just past the final exhibit, just beyond the last faded cartouche, you realise something both simple and massive. Egypt's obsession with sibling marriage wasn't just about gods or power, it was about fear. Not fear of outsiders or enemies, not really, but fear of chaos. Fear that without a pure bloodline, the whole delicate order beer would collapse like a pyramid made of sugar cubes. In a land where every sunrise was a gift and every flood a miracle, the idea of control was everything. And marrying your sister? That was control, weaponized. A divine loop tight and closed where the past, present and future could be sealed within the same royal veins. But now that loop lies broken. You head outside, blinking into the daylight, and the warmth feels almost aggressive after the cool tombs and quiet cases. The Nile glitters in the distance. Palm trees shudder in the breeze like they're shrugging off the weight of 5,000 years. The sound of a tour guide drifts over, half shouting about Horus and Ra, while someone else jokes about whether ancient pharaohs really married their siblings on purpose. You almost want to laugh. Almost. Because you know too much now. You know that, yes, it was on purpose, that it was policy, ritual, myth. You know that behind every golden mask was a family tree shaped like a knot. You know that while the priests spoke of balance and cosmic symmetry, midwives were wrapping tiny bodies in linen, again and again. And you know that some queens looked their brothers in the eye on wedding day and thought, this is the price. But you also know this. It worked. For a while. Egypt thrived under this system, despite everything. For centuries, the sibling marriage model delivered stable transitions, unified divine authority, and a mythic image that kept the population in awe. That model built temples, expanded borders, and shaped a civilization that we still romanticize today. But like all systems built on myth, it came with an expiration date. And when it broke, it didn't shatter overnight. It frayed, quietly, from within. Some scholars argue the true end began not with a war or a drought, but with a whisper. What if we marry outside the bloodline? A single question that cracked the mirror. And once people started asking it, even in hushed voices behind palace curtains or temple doors, the system started bleeding power. Others say it never truly ended. The modern rulers, ancient empires, and even corporate dynasties still play versions of the same game. Keep it in the family, control the inheritance, hoard the name, the image, the legacy. Bloodlines might not marry now, but money does. And the myth of sacred succession? Oh, it's alive and well. We've just traded ankhs for logos. You stroll along the riverbank now, watching the boats drift past, and imagine what the last true royal sibling marriage felt like. Maybe it was solemn, maybe it was desperate. Maybe they knew the world was changing, but clung to the ritual anyway because it was all they had left. The gods had grown quiet. The tomb builders were leaving errors in their stonework. The temples echoed more than they chanted, but still they wed. Brother to sister, as if that act alone could stop time. It didn't. The foreign powers came, the priesthoods collapsed, the myths turned to dust, and the royal bloodline, once so proudly preserved, was finally drowned out by centuries of war, assimilation, and forgetfulness. Fringe fact, the last confirmed king of Egypt to practice sibling marriage was probably one of the Ptolemies, most likely Ptolemy XII, Cleopatra's seventh father. By then, the act had become more performative than mystical, an echo of an echo. Cleopatra herself married her brotherly husbands to appease tradition, but she ruled alone in practice. The marriage was a costume she wore to keep the illusion going a little longer. And when she died, the illusion died with her. You sit on a sun-warmed stone now watching the water flow. It's tempting to mourn it all, the ambition, the artistry, the mad gamble of inbreeding for divine continuity. But maybe that's too easy. Maybe the real lesson isn't about collapse. Maybe it's about what people are willing to do, how far they'll go to keep a story alive. Because that's what this was, a story. A story that said, we are divine, we are one, the bloodline is unbroken. And when that story started showing cracks through fragile heirs, twisted limbs, childless queens, they didn't stop telling it. They just turned up the volume, added more gold, built bigger tombs, held longer festivals. The myth had to be louder than the truth, until it couldn't be. You rise, dusting sand from your hands, and turn away from the river. Behind you, the ruins of temples and palaces shimmer in the heat, stubborn and silent. They don't care if you believe in the myth. They don't care if you're impressed. They've outlived both truth and fiction. But you carry the story now, the real one, the messy one, the one where power and paranoia danced in sacred loops, where divine kings limped through ceremonies, where sister queens smiled through veils of jasmine, knowing their fate was sewn into their blood. And when someone asks you if the pharaohs really married their sisters, you'll say yes. But now you'll know why. Now you're walking deeper into the desert, far beyond the tourists and stone columns, beyond even the whispering fields of the Nile. There's nothing here but wind, sand, and the slow hum of time, the kind of place where stories come to rest, waiting to be remembered. You've followed the trail from golden thrones to crumbling bones, through dynasties and DNA, myth and mutation. And this is the end of the road. But endings in Egypt are never just endings, there are transformations. Just ask the pharaohs, just ask the gods. You sit on a dune, the horizon melting in heat waves, and try to hold it all in your head at once. The grandeur and the grief, the monuments and the migraines. A civilization that said our kings are gods, and then married those gods to their sisters. Again and again. Not out of lust or laziness, but out of cosmic conviction. That this was the only way to keep the world balanced, the sun rising, the Nile flowing, the people safe. And for a while it worked. They built eternity with bare hands, carved names into stone that still echoes, made death a doorway instead of an ending. But beneath it all ran that tight, unyielding spiral of blood. The sibling marriages, the divine unions, the children born with too many gods in their genes and not enough time in their lives. They were rulers, yes, but also sacrifices. Human offerings to an idea too beautiful, too powerful, too fragile to survive unchallenged. The brilliance of it, the poetry, is that they believed it so fully. You don't just marry your sister for politics, you do it because you truly, deeply think the universe needs you to. Because you believe the gods won't act unless your family becomes their mirror. Because anything less than that would be chaos. It's easy from this distance to scoff, to call it barbaric or backwards or doomed. But you've walked with them now, you've stood in the courtyards, sat in the shrines, watched the queens arrange their faces just right, you've seen the fear behind the rituals, the love buried in the control, and you know better than to dismiss it. So let's not end this story with judgment. Let's end it with understanding. These were people, brilliant, terrified, devoted people, trying to hold a civilization together with stories. And when the gods they invented demanded purity, they gave them everything, even their daughters, even their sons, even themselves. The final tomb you approach is a modest one, unfinished. Its inscriptions are shallow, the artwork rough. It was carved in haste, probably during a chaotic transition. The name has been scratched out, damaged by time maybe, or politics, but what's left is a single line, deep and deliberate. I have walked with the gods, I have carried their blood. That's it. No boasts of conquest, no lists of divine titles, just that, an exhausted confession from someone who lived the myth and bore its weight. You step inside and the light fades behind you. The air is cool, quiet, still. Maybe the occupant was a prince, maybe a queen, maybe one of the thousands of royal children who never made it past their second decade. There's no way to know, but you imagine them standing in the threshold between this world and the next, wrapped in linen, heavy with amulets, head held high, not because they wanted to be gods, but because they had no choice. Is that image that stays with you as you leave? Not the gold, not the power, but the child, the sibling, the vessel for 1,000 years of ambition and belief, laid gently in the sand like a myth that got too real. And now, as the wind erases your footprints and the sun begins to set, you understand what the pharaohs were really protecting. Not just their bloodline, not just their gods, but the illusion that perfection was possible, that the world could be held together by marrying your mirror. But mirrors crack and illusions fade, and still, we remember. Because the story was too big to forget, too human to dismiss, too tragic and beautiful and strange not to carry forward. So here you are. You've seen what they built, you've felt what they feared, and you've heard the heartbeat behind the myth. Now you can rest too.